It began with a symbol, a skull stitched in silver thread, grinning beneath a black cap like a warning sent from the grave. They called themselves the Death's Head, but behind that eerie emblem stood something far darker. In the early years of Hitler's rise, long before tanks roared across Europe, a unit was formed whose duty was not combat but domination. They stood guard over concentration camps, places of fear, silence, and systematic cruelty. From those men, shaped by obedience and indoctrination, would emerge an armored division that carried terror wherever it moved. The 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, the Death's Head. They were not simply soldiers, they were instruments of ideology. Their legacy would stretch from Poland to France, from the plains of Russia to the ruins of Hungary, a trail of ash, fire, and bodies. This is the story of the Death's Head Division, the iron heart of a regime that believed loyalty mattered more than humanity. Their origins were not on the battlefield, but inside the gates of places that were never meant to be seen. Men selected for ruthlessness were trained in the camp systems of Dachauer, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald. There, beneath barbed wire and guard towers, they learned discipline without mercy, orders without questions, and obedience without conscience. Their commander, Theodor Eicke, shaped them into something more than soldiers. Through indoctrination and brutality, he welded them into a force convinced that compassion was treason and violence was virtue. When war erupted in 1939, the Death's Head units left the camps, bringing with them the same mindset they had learned behind locked gates. In the invasion of France, their ruthless reputation was sealed forever. Near a farmhouse at Le Paradis, surrendered British prisoners were lined up and machine-gunned where they stood. Word of this massacre spread like poison through the Allied ranks, proof that this division did not fight by the laws of war. They believed terror itself was a weapon. The skull was no longer just an emblem. It was a message. When the war shifted east in June 1941, the Death's Head Division crossed into the Soviet Union as part of the invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa. For them, this was not a campaign, it was a crusade. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned to the ground. Prisoners were shot where they stood. Civilians vanished into ditches and were never seen again. On the Eastern Front they learned what the ideology demanded: total war, without hesitation, without remorse. In the winter of 1941 and 42, the division found itself trapped in the Demyansk Pocket, surrounded by Soviet forces on a battlefield of snow, starvation, and frozen corpses. Many divisions would have broken, the Death's Head did not. They clawed their way through the blockade, losing thousands. Their reward was transformation. Berlin refitted them as an armored division, a true SS Panzer formation. Steel now matched their ideology. By 1943, at Kursk, the largest tank battle in the history of the world, the Death's Head Division fought with brutal skill. Their tanks, Panthers, Panzer IVs, and assault guns, clashed with Soviet armor across fields of burning metal. Turrets were blown skyward. Crewmen burned alive in their machines. The Death's Head advanced again and again, but the Red Army would not yield. Kursk broke the back of German offensive power. After that summer, the Death's Head Division was always retreating. In 1944, they were sent to France to rebuild. But rebuilding and redemption are not the same. In June, after the Allied landings in Normandy, their columns were ambushed by French resistance fighters. In retaliation, the men of the Death's Head carried out one of the most horrific reprisals of the Western Front, the massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane. Hundreds of civilians, men, women, and children, were rounded up. The men were shot. The women and children were locked inside a church and burned alive. When the fire died, the skull insignia stood in the smoke. The division returned to the Eastern Front as the Reich crumbled. They fought in Hungary, part of the hopeless attempt to relieve Budapest. In Operation Spring Awakening, Hitler's final offensive, their tanks sank into mud and thawing ice, surrounded by Soviet forces that outnumbered them in every direction. When the offensive failed, Hitler blamed them, the very division that had served him without question. He ordered the Death's Head cuff titles stripped from their sleeves. Loyalty had met betrayal. In April and May 1945, the last survivors fought their final battles outside Vienna. Tanks burned in gardens. Streets were filled with rubble. The skull was still on their collars, but the empire it served was gone. When the end finally came, they surrendered. Trials followed. Some escaped under false identities. Others faced justice. The Death's Head Division represents the darkest truth of the Waffen-SS. They were skilled, but skill without conscience is not heroism. It is devastation. They were disciplined, but discipline without morality is simply obedience to evil. They were fearless, but courage in service of destruction is just another form of death. Today, the places where they marched are peaceful. Flowers grow over fields where villages once burned, but beneath the soil, the memory of the skull remains, a warning etched into time. The story of the Death's Head Division is not a story of valor. It is a warning. It is proof that the most dangerous soldiers are not those who fear death, but those who no longer recognize life. Tonight we return to those frozen roads, those ruined cities, and those fields where the skull advanced under a banner of conquest. This is the entire history of the 3rd SS Panzer Division, Totenkopf, the Death's Head. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? Are you somewhere warm and peaceful, far from the echo of engines and fire, or can you almost feel the winter wind of history moving past you? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. March 20th, 1933. The gates of Dachau concentration camp swing open for the first time under new management. Theodor Eicke, a failed businessman and convicted terrorist, walks through the entrance with a leather riding crop tucked under his arm. Heinrich Himmler has given him one assignment: transform this abandoned munitions factory into a model for controlling enemies of the state. What Eicke creates here in the next 18 months will not just define the concentration camp system, it will forge the institutional DNA of one of World War II's most feared combat divisions. The Death's Head symbol, the Totenkopf, wasn't new to German military tradition. Prussian hussars wore it proudly in the Napoleonic Wars, a cavalryman's badge of daring and death-defying courage. But when Eicke's guards pinned the silver skull to their black collars in 1933, they weren't inheriting honor, they were claiming something darker. The symbol now marked men who guarded Germany's internal enemies: communists, socialists, Jews, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, anyone the regime deemed unworthy of existence. These guards weren't soldiers preparing for foreign battlefields. They were jailers learning to terrorize unarmed prisoners. Eicke understood something fundamental about creating institutional cruelty. Individual sadists were unreliable, prone to excess that created scandal or mercy that created weakness. What the regime needed was systematic brutality, violence made routine through regulation and repetition. At Dachau, he drafted what became known as the Dachau Model, written regulations governing every aspect of prisoner control and punishment. Prisoners who spoke during roll call received 25 lashes. Those who disobeyed orders faced solitary confinement on bread and water. Anyone who attacked a guard would be hanged immediately, their body displayed as warning. But the regulations governing guards proved even more important than those governing prisoners. Ike demanded absolute obedience to orders. No matter how brutal, he forbade any personal conversation with prisoners, any recognition of their humanity. Guards who showed weakness or mercy faced immediate dismissal and often imprisonment themselves. This created a closed system of enforcement. Prisoners learned that guards would never help them. Guards learned that questioning orders meant joining the prisoners. Ike had industrialized dehumanization, turning it from individual choice into institutional requirement. By October 1934, Himmler promoted Ike to inspector of concentration camps and leader of SS Guard units. His jurisdiction now extended across Germany's growing camp system. Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, eventually a network that would span the Reich. The guards who staffed these camps formed separate SS units called Totenkopf Death's Head units. They wore distinctive uniforms, trained at Dachau under Ike's personal supervision, and developed fierce loyalty to their commander. These weren't typical SS men pursuing ideological warfare or racial supremacy as abstract concepts. These were men whose daily work involved inflicting suffering on defenseless human beings. The selection process for Totenkopf guards revealed Ike's understanding of psychology and institutional control. He didn't want psychopaths or obvious sadists. Those men were too unpredictable, too likely to create problems. Instead, he sought ordinary men who would follow orders, who valued belonging to an elite unit, who could be conditioned to see brutality as duty rather than choice. Many came from working-class backgrounds, unemployed during the Depression, grateful for steady SS wages and the prestige of a uniform. Ike gave them identity, purpose, and a system that rewarded obedience while punishing independent thought. Training at Dachau went far beyond typical military drill. Guards practiced what Essig called Scharfmassung, sharpening. This meant learning to administer punishment without emotion, to view prisoners not as individuals but as categories, the red triangles marking political prisoners, the green triangles marking criminals, the yellow stars marking Jews. Dehumanization became muscle memory through repetition. Guards conducted mock executions, learning to assemble prisoners, read false charges, march them to execution posts. The exercises ended without actual killing, but the psychological barrier had been crossed. The act of execution became routine before it became real. November 9th, 1938, brought Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Across Germany, synagogues burned, Jewish businesses shattered, communities terrorized. In the aftermath, Totenkopf units arrested 30,000 Jewish men, flooding concentration camps beyond capacity. Dachau's population exploded from 8,000 to nearly 11,000 overnight. Sachsenhausen received 10,000 more. The guards who processed these arrivals, beating them during intake, stripping them of possessions and dignity, cramming them into barracks designed for half their number, learned to operate at industrial scale. This wasn't punishment of individuals for specific crimes. This was processing of categories, logistics of oppression. For Ike's guards, Kristallnacht represented both validation and expansion. Their system worked. It could absorb massive influxes, maintain control through terror, process thousands while maintaining the appearance of order. The SS Totenkopf grew to roughly 24,000 men by early 1939, organized into 6 Standarte regiments named after the camps they guarded. Each Standarte developed its own subculture, pride in its particular institution, rivalry with other units. These men weren't just guards anymore. They saw themselves as elite soldiers in an ideological war. Their battlefield just happened to be behind barbed wire. The SS leadership structure carefully distinguished between different formations during the pre-war years. The Totenkopf Verbände guarded camps and remained separate from the Verfügungstruppe, the militarized SS formations training as conventional soldiers. This separation wasn't accidental. Camp guards developed skills fundamentally different from combat troops: control through intimidation, violence against the defenseless, psychological domination of trapped populations. These weren't skills that translated obviously to battlefield effectiveness, but in 1939, Adolf Hitler saw potential others missed. What if men hardened by years of institutionalized cruelty could bring that ruthlessness to frontline combat? Key personnel around Eike reflected the camp's corrupting influence. Hermann Bar-Arnowski, commandant of Sachsenhausen, perfected techniques for breaking political prisoners through isolation and random violence. Hans Lauritz, commanding Dachau after Eike's promotion, implemented collective punishment so severe that prisoner deaths from natural causes increased 40% under his command. Max Simon, Eike's trusted deputy, developed training programs that emphasized speed of obedience over questioning of orders. These weren't administrators. They were architects of a system that normalized atrocity through bureaucracy. The camps themselves evolved throughout the late 1930s from ad hoc detention facilities into precisely organized instruments of terror. Daily schedules ran with military precision, pre-dawn roll calls lasting hours in any weather, work details designed to exhaust rather than produce, evening formations where guards announced new restrictions. Prisoners lived in constant uncertainty. Punishments could be individual or collective, predictable or random. This deliberate unpredictability broke resistance more effectively than consistent brutality. Men learned that survival meant absolute submission, that any assertion of dignity invited destruction. Guards learned that they possessed absolute power, that their whims became reality within the wire. By early 1939, rumors spread through SS headquarters about militarizing the Totenkopf formations. Hitler's plans for expansion required more military formations than the regular Wehrmacht could provide. The SS wanted its own army, divisions that answered to Himmler rather than the traditional officer corps. But could concentration camp guards become soldiers? The Wehrmacht command viewed the proposal with skepticism bordering on contempt. Guarding prisoners required neither courage nor skill. Any thug could beat an unarmed man. Real combat demanded tactical thinking, coordinated action under fire, physical courage against armed opponents. The death's head symbol might intimidate prisoners, but would it mean anything when Soviet artillery began falling? Eike himself understood the distinction between his guards' current skills and combat requirements, but he possessed absolute faith that ideology could overcome tactical deficiency, that National Socialist fanaticism represented a force multiplier greater than training or experience. His men had proven their ruthlessness, their obedience, their willingness to commit acts conventional soldiers might refuse. In Eike's vision, the perfect soldier combined military competence with ideological commitment, and if his men lacked the former, intensive training could provide it. What they already possessed: the psychological conditioning to dehumanize enemies, the institutional loyalty to follow any order, the years of inflicting violence without moral hesitation, couldn't be taught in any Wehrmacht. The question facing Nazi Germany's leadership in mid-1939 wasn't whether Eike's men could guard camps. They'd proven that capability beyond doubt. The question was whether guards trained to terrorize prisoners could hold positions against enemy armies, whether men whose battlefield experience consisted of beating defenseless civilians could advance under machine gun fire. The concentration camps had forged 24,000 men into institutional instruments of oppression. Could those same instruments be retooled for conventional warfare? Or would the attempt reveal that cruelty and courage, while both involving violence, emerged from fundamentally different psychological sources? Adolf Hitler announced the formation of new SS divisions in the summer of 1939 as Europe slid toward war. Among them, an SS Totenkopf division drawn from concentration camp guards. Theodor Eicke received command with less than 2 months to transform his jailers into soldiers. He faced challenges no other division commander encountered, not just training men for combat, but overcoming institutional culture built on asymmetric violence. His guards had spent years learning that enemies couldn't fight back, that victory meant domination of the helpless. Now they would face opponents who shot back, situations where fanaticism alone couldn't guarantee survival. The death's head symbol was about to face its first real test. Whether it represented empty intimidation or genuine lethality would be determined not in concentration camp yards, but on the battlefields of France and Russia, and the answer would prove far more complex than anyone anticipated. October 16th, 1939. Theodor Eicke receives a telephone call from Heinrich Himmler's headquarters in Berlin. The war against Poland has concluded in 4 weeks of mechanized destruction, validating Hitler's military gambles and emboldening his next moves. Himmler's message is brief. Eicke has 48 hours to begin forming an SS Totenkopf division. The concentration camp inspector must become a division commander, his guards must become soldiers, and the transformation must happen before winter. Eicke hangs up the phone and stares at the map of Germany on his office wall. His challenge isn't finding men. He commands 24,000 Totenkopf guards across the Reich. His challenge is transforming their fundamental nature before France demands proof of their combat value. The selection process reveals immediate tensions in Eicke's vision. He cannot simply empty the concentration camps. Prisoners still require guards. The internal security system still demands staffing. So Eicke creates a hierarchy of selection based on age and physical fitness. Guards under 28 with clean medical records receive transfer orders to the new division. Older guards, those with injuries or chronic conditions, remain at the camps. This split creates the division's first internal culture clash. The roughly 6,000 concentration camp veterans joining the division bring institutional knowledge and unwavering loyalty to Eicke. But their skills involve inflicting violence on bound prisoners, not tactical maneuvers under hostile fire. To fill out his division's strength to roughly 14,000 men, Eicke must accept transfers from other SS formations. Approximately 4,000 men arrive from the Verfügungstruppe, militarized SS units that have been training as conventional infantry. These soldiers view the concentration camp guards with barely concealed contempt. They've spent months practicing small unit tactics, coordinated advances, defensive positions. The camp guards know how to assemble prisoners for roll call and administer systematic beatings. The cultural divide between these groups, both wearing the same SS runes on their collars, threatens unit cohesion before training even begins. Eicke addresses this by enforcing absolute authority. Anyone questioning another member's background faces immediate punishment. Unity through intimidation, the same principle he applied to camp administration. The remaining 4,000 slots fill with new SS recruits, many fresh from Reichsarbeitsdienst, the Reich Labor Service, or straight from Hitler Youth organizations. These young men, many 17 or 18 years old, arrive at training camps with heads full of propaganda and zero military experience. They worship the SS mystique, see the Totenkopf symbol, as romantic rather than sinister. Meeting actual concentration camp guards, men who casually discuss processing prisoners or handling resistors, shock some recruits into silence. Others absorb the casual brutality as validation of their ideological education. This generational mix creates a volatile combination: hardened cynics who've normalized atrocity, trained soldiers who view war as craft, and naive believers who think violence serves noble purpose. Dachau concentration camp becomes the division's initial training ground, a choice rich with symbolism and practical problems. The very location where IK perfected his camp system now hosts attempts to create a combat division. Prisoners watch from behind wire as SS recruits practice close order drill in the assembly areas where they've stood for years during roll call. The psychological atmosphere is toxic. Guards assigned to the division must shift their thinking from controlling prisoners to preparing for enemies who shoot back, while new recruits train in facilities permeated by the camp's atmosphere of casual cruelty. Several recruits desert during the first weeks, unable to reconcile the reality of SS service with their propaganda-fed expectations. IK orders them hunted down and court-martialed, using their punishment as lessons in obedience. Equipment procurement exposes how unprepared Germany is to field additional divisions. The Wehrmacht receives priority for new production. The army's tank battalions get the latest panzer models, its infantry regiments receive standardized German weapons. IK's division must scavenge from stocks of captured Czech and Polish equipment. His tank battalion receives outdated Czech Panzer 35 and 38 models, mechanically unreliable and inferior to French armor they'll soon face. The artillery regiment gets a mixture of German and captured Polish guns, complicating ammunition logistics and training. Small arms vary wildly. Some companies carry standard Kar 98 rifles, others receive Czech or Polish weapons with different ammunition and maintenance requirements. This hodgepodge of equipment guarantees logistics nightmares and limits tactical effectiveness. The division's organizational structure follows standard Wehrmacht infantry division patterns. 3 infantry regiments designated Totenkopf, 1, 2, and 3, plus support units, including artillery, engineers, and reconnaissance. Each regiment contains roughly 3,000 men in 3 battalions. On paper, this matches regular army organization. In practice, the division lacks the institutional knowledge embedded in Wehrmacht units. German army regiments accumulate tactical wisdom across generations, lessons from the Great War, refined doctrines, experienced non-commissioned officers who pass knowledge to new soldiers. Eich's regiments have no such inheritance. His officers learned their leadership in camps, where failure to obey meant punishment rather than death, where tactical problems involved controlling unarmed populations rather than coordinating fire and maneuver. Training at the Grafenwehr proving grounds beginning in January 1940 exposes these deficiencies brutally. Standard Wehrmacht training for infantry divisions typically spans 8 to 12 months, building progressively from individual soldier skills through small unit tactics to battalion and regimental operations. Eich's division receives 4 to 5 months before deployment to the French border. This compressed timeline means shortcuts, superficial learning, gaps in fundamental skills. Platoon leaders who've never led men in tactical exercises must suddenly coordinate attacks with armor and artillery support. Company commanders who've never called for indirect fire support struggle with map reading and radio communication. Battalion staffs who've never planned movements under threat of enemy contact learn logistics under pressure of imminent deployment. Shek's response to training deficiencies reveals both his strengths and dangerous limitations as a military commander. He cannot teach what he doesn't know. His own military experience amounts to service as a junior paymaster in the Great War, followed by 2 decades as a failed businessman and camp administrator. But he understands motivation, discipline, and institutional conditioning. So he imposes concentration camp management techniques on military training, brutal physical punishment for mistakes, public humiliation for failures, cultivation of unit identity through isolation from outside influence. Men learn that admitting inadequacy means punishment, that questioning tactics invites retribution. This creates superficial appearance of competence while suppressing the honest self-assessment necessary for actual learning. The winter of 1939–40 at Grafenwehr becomes a crucible of conflicting military cultures. Wehrmacht observers assigned to monitor SS training submit reports describing chaos masquerading as discipline. They note that Eiche's officers compensate for tactical ignorance with screaming and physical intimidation. They observe that live-fire exercises proceed with minimal safety margins, resulting in dozens of training casualties. A wounded soldier represents failure in Wehrmacht doctrine. But Eiche treats casualties as proof his training approximates combat reality. Regular army instructors assigned to teach basic skills clash with Eiche's camp guard officers over methodology. The Wehrmacht favors systematic skill development. Eiche favors ideological indoctrination and punishment-driven compliance. The result is a division that looks impressive on parade, but lacks the tactical cohesion of equivalent Wehrmacht units. Yet something else emerges during these months that Wehrmacht observers fail to understand or appreciate. Eiches is deliberately creating unit cohesion through shared hardship and isolation from conventional military culture. His men train in brutal weather, endure punishment for minor infractions, live in conditions barely better than the camps many guarded. But they also develop fierce loyalty to the Totenkopf identity and absolute faith in Eiche's leadership. He cultivates a family atmosphere, officers eat with enlisted men, decorations are distributed based on Eiche's personal approval rather than formal recommendation channels. Complaints about conditions or training are treated as betrayals of the unit rather than legitimate feedback. This combination of brutality and belonging creates psychological bonds that conventional military discipline cannot match. His men aren't just soldiers in a division, they're members of a closed society with its own values and complete contempt for outsiders. The Führerprinzip leadership principle reaches its extreme interpretation in Eiche's command style. Hitler's notion that each level of organization follows its leader's will absolutely becomes totalitarian within the Totenkopf division. Eiche demands personal loyalty over professional competence, rewards aggression over tactical thinking, promotes officers who mirror his own worldview rather than those demonstrating military aptitude. This creates an officer corps fundamentally different from Wehrmacht standards. In the regular army, officers debate tactics, critique operations, offer alternative approaches to their commanders. In Eiche's division, disagreement equals disloyalty, critique equals weakness, alternative suggestions equal insubordination. The command climate suppresses initiative and independent thinking, precisely the qualities most necessary for success in fluid combat. The weapons available to Eiche's division reflect Germany's industrial priorities and his unit's second-class status, while elite Wehrmacht divisions received the latest Maschinengewehr 34 machine guns and Panzerabwehrkanone anti-tank guns. The Totenkopf division makes do with older models and captured weapons. The tank battalion's Czech Panzer 38s are mechanically sound but undergunned compared to French armour. The artillery regiment's mixture of German 10.5 cm Ley Fetch 18 howitzers and Polish weapons creates ammunition supply nightmares. Anti-tank companies carry the Pak 37mm gun that Wehrmacht veterans already call the door knocker for its inability to penetrate modern tank armour. This equipment inferiority means Eicke's division will enter combat at a tactical disadvantage beyond its training deficiencies. By May 1940, as Germany masses forces along the French and Belgian borders for Wessenschlag, the Western Campaign, the Totenkopf division assembles in its staging areas. 14,000 men wearing the Death's Head insignia prepare for their first taste of combat. They've trained for barely 5 months, using equipment inferior to their Wehrmacht counterparts, under officers whose primary expertise involves terrorizing prisoners. Army commanders view their attachment to conventional corps with skepticism. These SS units consume logistics resources while providing uncertain combat value. But Heinrich Himmler has ensured his pet divisions receive prominent roles in the upcoming offensive. The Totenkopf will enter Belgium as part of the follow-on waves, exploiting breakthroughs achieved by Wehrmacht armour and infantry. The men themselves show a mixture of eagerness and apprehension as deployment approaches. The concentration camp veterans, now holding most non-commissioned officer positions, display confidence that borders on arrogance. They've enforced the regime's will against internal enemies for years, and France represents simply a different category of opponent. The younger recruits oscillate between excitement and terror, their propaganda education colliding with rumors of French artillery and tank capabilities. The Wehrmacht transfers maintain professional detachment, concerned about serving in a unit where ideology matters more than competence. None of them, not the veterans, not the recruits, not the skeptics, understand what they're about to experience. No amount of training at Grafenwehr can prepare men for the reality of combat, the noise, the confusion, the sudden presence of death from impersonal distances. Theodor Eicke reviews his division before departure with satisfaction that circumstances won't validate. He sees 14,000 men bound by ideology and loyalty to him personally. He sees the Totenkopf symbol, proving that concentration camp guards can become soldiers. He sees the opportunity to demonstrate that National Socialist fanaticism overcomes tactical deficiency. What he doesn't see, because his institutional culture suppresses honest assessment, are the dangerous gaps in his division's capabilities. His men don't understand combined arms coordination. His officers can't read a battlefield or adapt to unexpected resistance. His unit lacks the institutional wisdom that helps veteran formations survive their first combat experiences. The Death's Head division is about to enter France supremely confident and fundamentally unprepared. Some lessons can only be learned through blood. The Totenkopf division is about to pay tuition in Belgian soil. May 16, 1940. The Totenkopf division crosses the Belgian border in the wake of Wehrmacht armoured spearheads that have already shattered Allied defensive lines. The men expect triumph and rapid advance. Propaganda has prepared them for French collapse, for enemy armies melting before German superiority. Instead, they encounter something their training never prepared them for: the simple, terrifying reality of modern warfare's indiscriminate violence. The first artillery barrage catches Totenkopf infantry advancing in parade ground formations across open ground. French 75mm shells burst overhead, transforming organized columns into screaming chaos. Men dive for ditches, press themselves into mud, discover that ideology provides no protection against high explosive fragmentation. This is the division's first lesson. Combat doesn't care about your beliefs. The initial advance through Belgium proceeds adequately when opposition is light or absent. The Totenkopf division follows paved roads, encounters villages already abandoned by French and Belgian defenders, begins to believe that conquest might match their expectations. But May 19th and 20th bring the division's first serious engagement near Cambrai, where British rearguard forces from the 4th and 5th Battalions have established defensive positions along canal lines. These British soldiers, professional infantry with combat experience, wait until Totenkopf units approach within effective range before opening fire. The result is carnage. German infantry, advancing with insufficient reconnaissance and poor coordination with supporting weapons, walk into interlocking fields of fire from Bren gun positions and Leonfield rifles. Entire platoons shatter under fire they never saw coming. The tank battalion's performance against British positions reveals the consequences of inadequate training and inferior equipment. Czech Panzer 38's advance without infantry support, a fundamental violation of armour doctrine that Wehrmacht units would never commit. British 2-pounder anti-tank guns, positioned in prepared emplacements, destroy 16 tanks in the first engagement. The Totenkopf crews learn bitter lessons about combined arms warfare. Tanks without infantry support can't suppress anti-tank positions, armour without reconnaissance blunders into kill zones, aggression without tactical intelligence equals suicide, but these lessons come at catastrophic cost. Burning panzers litter the approaches to British positions. Crews who survive burns and explosions stream back through their own infantry, spreading panic through their own reports of effective enemy defence. The battle for canal crossings near Cambrai exposes every deficiency in the Totenkopf division's preparation. Infantry attacks proceed through frontal assaults without flanking manoeuvres, the simplest tactical approach, requiring minimal coordination but maximum courage. British defenders, protected by earthworks and concrete emplacements, inflict casualties at ratios that would be unsustainable in prolonged fighting. Ache responds not by adjusting tactics, but by demanding renewed attacks, interpreting hesitation as cowardice and failure as insufficient will. This is concentration camp logic applied to combat. Problems are solved through increased brutality, setbacks overcome through harsher punishment. Officers who report that attacks are failing without better artillery support face Ache's rage rather than tactical discussion. The division learns that admitting reality means inviting retribution from their own commander. May 27th brings the incident that will define the Totenkopf division's reputation beyond any battlefield achievement. Company commander Fritz Knorklein, leading elements of Totenkopf Infantry Regiment 2, assaults the village of Le Paradis against determined resistance from British Royal Norfolk Regiment soldiers. The British fight from fortified positions, inflicting significant casualties on attacking Germans before finally being overrun and surrendering. 97 British soldiers lay down their weapons and raise their hands. What happens next reveals the direct line connecting concentration camp culture to battlefield atrocity. Knorklein orders the prisoners marched to a barn wall, then commands 2 Maschinengewehr 34 machine guns to open fire. The massacre takes less than 2 minutes. Knorklein's men then walk among the bodies, shooting survivors with pistols. 2 British soldiers, Private Pooley and Private O'Callaghan, survive by playing dead beneath their comrades' corpses. The Les Paradis massacre wasn't an isolated aberration born from combat stress. It was the logical product of the Totenkopf division's institutional culture. Kontrolin had served as concentration camp guard before the war, where violence against defenseless people was daily routine. His orders to murder prisoners represented applying camp logic to military circumstances. Prisoners are burdens, killing them eliminates problems. Witnesses can be silenced. The casual efficiency of the massacre, the methodical machine gun fire, the practiced coup de grace shots, the lack of hesitation among the execution squad demonstrates that these skills transferred directly from camp to battlefield. The death's head symbol worn by guards who'd spent years perfecting techniques for killing bound prisoners now marked soldiers who extended those techniques to prisoners of war. Theodor Eicke's wounding on May 28th paradoxically demonstrates both his leadership's importance and its deficiencies. Shrapnel from a French artillery shell catches him while he visits forward positions, a practice that exposes him to danger but earns respect from subordinates. His evacuation for medical treatment nearly breaks the division's cohesion. Officers accustomed to receiving direct orders from Eicke struggle to maintain coordination without his domineering presence. The temporary command structure reveals how thoroughly the division's effectiveness depends on one man's forceful personality rather than institutional competence. Wehrmacht divisions function through trained staff officers and established procedures. The Totenkopf division functions through Eicke's charisma and intimidation. Remove him, and the organization begins to fragment. Yet the same day Eicke falls wounded, the division achieves its first significant tactical success. Elements of Totenkopf Reconnaissance Battalion exploit gaps in French lines, advancing rapidly through territory that defending forces assume is secured. This success comes not from superior tactics, but from aggressive exploitation of enemy confusion, exactly the kind of initiative that concentration camp training paradoxically enabled. Men who've spent years enforcing their will on helpless prisoners don't hesitate when opportunities appear. They advance without waiting for orders, operate beyond communication range without panic, press forward while other units consolidate. The Totenkopf division demonstrates that ruthlessness and initiative, while not substitutes for tactical competence, can occasionally produce results in fluid situations. The pursuit operations of early June show the division in circumstances matching its capabilities. When enemy forces retreat, when resistance collapses, when the tactical problem becomes movement rather than fighting, the Totenkopf excels. Infantry advance rapidly through abandoned French villages. Tank units race along roads, bypassing pockets of resistance for Wehrmacht follow-on forces to handle. The division covers impressive distances, maintaining pace with mechanized units, despite being primarily foot infantry. This performance temporarily validates Eicke's confidence and silences Wehrmacht critics who predicted SS failures, but this success conceals important distinctions. Exploitation differs fundamentally from assault, movement differs from fighting, pursuing defeated enemies differs from breaking prepared defenses. By mid-June, as France collapses and Germany's victory becomes inevitable, preliminary assessments of the Totenkopf division's performance circulate through Wehrmacht headquarters. The numbers tell mixed stories. The division advanced over 450 kilometers in 3 weeks. Impressive mobility. But casualties totaled 1,140 men. 8% of division strength, lost in a campaign that most Wehrmacht divisions completed with 2 to 3% casualties. The tank battalion lost 39 of its 98 operational tanks. Unsustainable attrition in a longer campaign. Wehrmacht staff officers note tactical deficiencies, poor reconnaissance, inadequate combined arms coordination, tendency toward frontal assaults, regardless of circumstances. One assessment describes the division as brave but poorly trained and led, professional soldiers' polite way of saying that courage couldn't compensate for incompetence. The Liber Paradis massacre begins its slow journey toward post-war justice during the French campaign itself. Private Pooley, and Private O'Callaghan, both wounded and lying among corpses for hours, eventually reach French civilians who hide them from Germans. Their testimony about the massacre reaches British intelligence, where it joins growing files about SS atrocities. But in June 1940, with France defeated and Britain facing potential invasion, war crimes documentation ranks low among priorities. The massacre becomes another data point in British intelligence assessments. SS divisions fight hard but routinely commit atrocities. This pattern will repeat across Europe for the next 5 years. The Totenkopf symbol, meant to intimidate enemies, instead marks units that win tactical victories at costs human and moral that regular armies find appalling. Internal Totenkopf Division. Assessments of the French campaign reach very different conclusions from Wehrmacht reports. Eich, recovering from his wounds, declares the campaign a triumphant validation of ideological soldiers. He highlights the division's aggressive advances, its willingness to attack when other units hesitated, its absolute obedience to orders. He dismisses casualties as acceptable prices for victory, equipment losses as irrelevant given Germany's industrial capacity. Most importantly, he frames the campaign as proving that concentration camp veterans possess warrior virtues superior to traditional military professionalism. The division's internal culture accepts this narrative completely. Officers who might privately question tactics remain silent. Disagreeing with Eich means risking career destruction or reassignment back to camp guard duty. The institutional culture that suppresses honest assessment ensures the division can't learn from mistakes. The contrast between Wehrmacht and SS assessments of the Totenkopf division's France performance reveals fundamentally different organizational cultures. The German army views war as craft, requiring continuous improvement through honest evaluation. Units submit after-action reports, documenting failures as thoroughly as successes, identifying tactical deficiencies requiring correction. The SS views war as ideological struggle, where will determines outcomes more than technique. Units submit reports emphasizing triumph and vindication, treating criticism as defeatism or disloyalty. These divergent approaches produce divergent outcomes. Wehrmacht divisions improve through successive campaigns, incorporating lessons and refining tactics. The Totenkopf division repeats mistakes across campaigns because its institutional culture can't acknowledge mistakes without undermining ideological foundations. The prisoners taken by Totenkopf units during the French campaign, those not murdered immediately like the British soldiers at Le Paradis, tell stories that begin reaching British intelligence through debriefing after repatriation or escape. French soldiers describe SS guards who treat prisoners with contempt, learned in concentration camps, casual brutality, arbitrary punishment, dehumanizing treatment. British prisoners describe interrogations where SS officers display absolute certainty of racial and cultural superiority, viewing captured enemies not as fellow soldiers but as inferior specimens. These reports complement intelligence from other sources, intercepted German communications, documents captured during brief advances, testimony from French civilians. A picture emerges of the Totenkopf division as militarily competent but morally bankrupt, tactically aggressive but war crime prone. As June 1940 ends with France defeated and Germany triumphant, the Totenkopf division moves to occupation duties in the Bordeaux region of southwestern France. The men who crossed into Belgium a month earlier have been transformed by combat, some broken by its violence, others hardened by survival, all changed by exposure to warfare's random cruelty. They've learned that artillery doesn't distinguish between ideological soldiers and regular infantry, that enemy tanks penetrate armor regardless of the defender's political beliefs, that combat effectiveness depends on tactics and training more than fanaticism. But institutional culture prevents these lessons from being systematically incorporated. Instead, the division's narrative becomes one of triumph against skeptics, vindication of Eike's vision, proof that concentration camp training produces superior warriors. This false narrative, accepted internally and promoted externally, ensures the division will continue patterns that produced both its successes and its crimes. The death's head symbol has been baptized in combat. Whether that baptism redeemed or merely confirmed its sinister origins remains unresolved. The answer will come not in France's quick collapse, but in Russia's grinding attrition. July 15, 1940. The Totenkopf division assembles in occupied Bordeaux for what Theodore Eike calls a reckoning conference. Officers crowd into a commandeered French municipal building, while Eike, still recovering from his shrapnel wounds, dissects the French campaign with brutal honesty reserved only for internal audiences. He doesn't dispute the casualty figures or equipment losses. Those numbers can't be hidden from men who watched comrades die. Instead, he reframes them as tuition paid for essential lessons. The division learned which tactics work and which kill. Now comes the hard part: transforming those lessons into doctrine, while Wehrmacht critics sharpen their assessments and recommend dissolving SS divisions entirely. Eike has 6 months before Germany's next campaign. 6 months to prove his vision of ideological warriors can evolve beyond suicidal bravery into sophisticated lethality. The after-action analysis Eike presents to his officers bears little resemblance to Wehrmacht doctrine or methodology. Traditional German military assessment emphasizes systematic evaluation: what succeeded, what failed, why, and how to improve. Eike's approach combines concentration camp management philosophy with selective military professionalism. He identifies 3 categories of failure: insufficient aggression, inadequate brutality toward enemies, and officers who questioned orders. Notice what's absent: tactical mistakes, coordination failures, training deficiencies. In Eike's framework, the solution to every problem involves intensifying the characteristics that define Totenkopf culture. Units that suffered high casualties didn't attack aggressively enough. Officers whose men hesitated under fire failed to instill proper ideological commitment. The division's performance problems resulted not from inadequate preparation, but from insufficient ruthlessness. Yet beneath this ideological posturing, Eike incorporates genuine tactical lessons learned through blood. He mandates combined arms training, where infantry, armor, and artillery practice coordinated operations rather than separate exercises. He orders reconnaissance units to train for actual intelligence gathering rather than simply racing ahead of main forces. He establishes formal procedures for coordinating tank infantry assaults, ensuring armor doesn't advance unsupported into kill zones. These changes mirror Wehrmacht best practices. Eike is pragmatic enough to steal effective methods from organizations he publicly disdains, but he implements them through characteristically brutal methodology. Officers who fail to master new procedures face immediate relief. Units that perform poorly in exercises face punishment. Details mistakes result in public humiliation rather than corrective instruction. The training regimen established at Bordeaux during summer and fall 1940 becomes legendary within the division and notorious among Wehrmacht observers. Eike mandates live-fire exercises with minimal safety margins, deliberately creating dangerous conditions to simulate combat stress. Soldiers advance through machine gun fire with rounds passing meters overhead, closer than any responsible training would permit. Artillery barrages land within 50 meters of friendly infantry positions, teaching soldiers to trust supporting fire and continue advancing despite nearby explosions. Casualties become inevitable. At least 23 men die in training accidents between July and December, the highest training fatality rate of any German division. Ike treats these deaths as acceptable costs for creating combat-realistic preparation. Wehrmacht safety inspectors viewing Totenkopf exercises submit reports recommending immediate shutdown, recommendations Himmler ensures disappear into bureaucratic void. September 1940 brings Heinrich Himmler's personal visit to Bordeaux, ostensibly for inspection, but actually for ideological reinforcement. The Reichsführer SS uses the occasion to emphasize the coming war against Bolshevism, framing future campaigns as racial struggle rather than conventional warfare. His speeches to assembled Totenkopf soldiers describe the Soviet Union as existential threat to Germanic civilization, portraying Russians as subhuman masses requiring extermination rather than defeat. This isn't standard military preparation. Wehrmacht officers brief their troops on enemy capabilities, tactics, likely operational challenges. Himmler's indoctrination prepares soldiers psychologically to commit atrocities by defining enemies as outside normal human categories. The distinction matters tremendously. Soldiers fighting other soldiers follow certain rules even in brutal conflict. Soldiers fighting subhumans follow no rules because the category eliminates moral constraints. The officer corps transformation during the Bordeaux period reveals Ike's ruthless approach to building institutional culture. He identifies roughly 30% of company and battalion commanders as insufficiently aggressive or ideologically suspect, meaning they question orders, suggest alternative tactics, or show reluctance toward brutality. These officers receive transfers to rear area positions, garrison duty, or in some cases return to concentration camp guard duties. Their replacements come almost exclusively from the concentration camp veteran cohort, men whose primary qualification is absolute loyalty to Ike and proven willingness to commit violence without hesitation. By early 1941, 67% of company commanders are former camp guards. The division's leadership now reflects its origins more thoroughly than during its formation. October and November bring equipment upgrades that finally give the division capability matching its ambitions. The Czech Panzer 38s, mechanically sound but undergunned, receive supplementation with German Panzer 3s and 4s. The artillery regiment exchanges its mixture of captured weapons for standardized German 10.5 cm howitzers, dramatically simplifying logistics and improving reliability. Most significantly, the division receives its first Stig assault guns, low-profile armored vehicles mounting 75 mm guns, perfect for direct infantry support. These equipment improvements matter enormously. The French campaign demonstrated that ideology couldn't compensate for inferior weapons. Now the Totenkopf division possesses firepower comparable to elite Wehrmacht formations. The question becomes whether tactical competence has improved commensurately with material capability. The comradeship culture Ike deliberately cultivates during this period represents perhaps his most significant innovation in military leadership and his most dangerous contribution to institutional criminality. He breaks down traditional distinctions between officers and enlisted men in ways Wehrmacht would never permit. Officers eat identical meals with their soldiers, share accommodations, participate in the same physical training. Ike personally knows hundreds of enlisted men by name, visits units unannounced to hear complaints directly, distributes decorations based on personal observation rather than formal channels. This creates extraordinary loyalty but terrible consequences. Units become closed societies with internal codes superseding military regulations. Soldiers develop allegiance to immediate commanders, and Ike personally, rather than to Germany or even the SS as institution. This tribalism ensures cohesion in combat. Men fight for comrades rather than abstract causes. But it also ensures atrocities when the tribe's values include dehumanizing enemies. Group loyalty reinforces rather than restrains criminal behavior. Winter exercises during December 1940 and January 1941 incorporate lessons learned from Wehrmacht veterans of the Polish campaign, not because Ike respects their professionalism, but because he recognizes their utility. The division practices rapid advances over varied terrain, learning to maintain cohesion during exploitation operations. Infantry battalions drill on rapid entrenchment and defensive fighting, preparing for inevitable Soviet counterattacks. Tank units train on maintenance under field conditions, learning to repair battle damage and mechanical failures without depot support. These exercises lack ideological component. They're purely technical preparation for operational demands. But Ike ensures they proceed with characteristic brutality. Soldiers who fall behind during marches face punishment. Officers whose units perform poorly endure public criticism. Any sign of weakness invites retribution. February 1941 brings the division's most revealing exercise. Assault on a mock Soviet village constructed by engineers at the training ground. The scenario begins with intelligence reports of partisan activity, proceeds through encirclement and assault, concludes with occupation and pacification operations. Wehrmacht units conducting similar exercises focus on tactical execution, coordinating fires, clearing structures, securing objectives. The Totenkopf exercise includes simulated executions of commissars and partisans, role-playing of interrogation and summary justice, practice in distinguishing between cooperative and hostile civilians. This isn't combat training, it's rehearsal for war crimes. Ike is preparing his division not just to fight the Red Army, but to implement ideological war against Soviet population. The exercise ends with Ike praising units that showed appropriate hardness and criticizing those that hesitated during simulated executions. The tactical doctrine emerging from 6 months of training combines legitimate military innovation with institutionalized criminality. On the professional side, Ike's division has mastered combined arms coordination that eluded it in France. Infantry companies understand how to advance behind armor, using tanks to suppress enemy positions while riflemen close for assault. Artillery battalions can deliver accurate supporting fire, adjusting based on forward observer reports. Reconnaissance elements actually scout ahead rather than blundering into ambushes. These improvements reflect hard-won lessons and intensive training. The Totenkopf division of early 1941 is tactically competent in ways it wasn't during the French campaign. But professional competence coexists with doctrinal criminality. No prisoners in combat zones, shoot commissars on capture. Partisan activity justifies collective punishment. The division has become simultaneously more effective and more dangerous. The cultural atmosphere within the division by spring 1941 combines military pride with ideological fanaticism in proportions that would alarm any professional officer corps. Soldiers believe themselves elite warriors proven in France and perfected through brutal training. They wear the Totenkopf symbol as badge of superiority over Wehrmacht formations. They view Ike with devotion bordering on worship. His personal leadership style, his willingness to share hardships, his aggressive defense of the division against outside criticism have created cult of personality. But this pride and cohesion rest on foundations of institutionalized amorality. The division's internal culture valorizes ruthlessness, treats brutality as virtue, defines hardness as highest character trait. Men who question whether shooting prisoners violates military honor face ridicule from comrades and potential punishment from superiors. The Totenkopf division has become self-contained moral universe with values inverted from civilized norms. Training fatalities during the Bordeaux period. 23 confirmed deaths from July to December 1940 reveal the division's fundamental indifference to individual life. Wehrmacht training produces occasional accidents despite safety protocols. The Totenkopf division's fatality rate exceeds Wehrmacht averages by a factor of 5, because Ike deliberately creates dangerous conditions. When artillery shells land too close to friendly positions, killing soldiers during exercises, he declares this realistic training rather than criminal negligence. When live-fire exercises result in soldiers hit by machine gun fire, he praises survivors for learning to advance under fire rather than investigating safety violations. This normalization of training deaths performs crucial psychological function. It desensitizes soldiers to death's presence, making battlefield casualties seem routine rather than traumatic. But it also reinforces the institutional message that individual lives matter less than collective capability. The division's isolation from Wehrmacht influence during the Bordeaux period allows Eiche to create institutional culture, increasingly divergent from military professionalism. He forbids officers from socializing with Wehrmacht counterparts in nearby units. He restricts soldiers' interactions with French civilians, maintaining unit psychological separation from occupied population. He ensures that decorations, promotions, and privileges flow through Totenkopf's internal systems rather than regular military channels. This deliberate isolation serves multiple purposes. It prevents Wehrmacht values from contaminating SS ideology, ensures loyalty flows to Eiche rather than German military establishment, and creates collective identity based on separation from and superiority to conventional forces. The Totenkopf division isn't just another military formation, it's become tribe unto itself, with distinct values, internal justice, and moral framework disconnected from outside world. By May 1941, as Germany masses forces for Operation Barbarossa, the Totenkopf division represents Theodor Eiche's completed vision. It combines tactical competence developed through brutal training, ideological commitment, reinforced through constant indoctrination, and institutional culture, valuing ruthlessness above all other characteristics. Equipment improvements have given the division firepower matching elite Wehrmacht formations. Personnel changes have placed concentration camp veterans in most leadership positions. Training has eliminated obvious deficiencies that caused excessive casualties in France. The division is objectively more capable than the formation that crossed into Belgium 12 months earlier. But this capability serves ideology that defines enemies as subhuman and war as racial extermination. The Totenkopf symbol worn by these soldiers represents not just military formation, but institutional embodiment of Nazi Germany's most criminal ambitions. What AK created at Bordeaux wasn't simply combat division, it was instrument designed to excel at both conventional warfare and systematic atrocity. The testing ground for this double capability wouldn't be France's organized countryside, but Russia's endless expanse, and the test would reveal that tactical competence and moral depravity aren't contradictory, they're complementary in ideological warfare. February 8, 1942. Soviet artillery opens bombardment along a 100-kilometer front south of Lake Ilmen, shells falling in concentrations that obliterate German forward positions and sever communication lines. The Soviet 11th and 1st Shock armies, reinforced to nearly 200,000 men, surge forward through snowdrifts in temperatures approaching -40 degrees Celsius. Their objective: encircle and destroy 6 German divisions, including the Totenkopf, cutting off roughly 96,000 Wehrmacht and SS soldiers in what will become known as the Demyansk Pocket. For most German units, this encirclement represents potential catastrophe. Winter in Russia has already demonstrated that surrounded forces die slowly from cold, starvation, and continuous assault. For the Totenkopf division, Demyansk will become something else entirely: forge that transforms ideological soldiers into hardened veterans, crucible that burns away remaining distinctions between fanaticism and military professionalism. The encirclement closes within 48 hours of the Soviet offensive's beginning. German forces retreat in disorder, attempting to establish defensive perimeters as Soviet armor and infantry sever roads and rail lines. The Totenkopf division holds positions along the Lovett River when the trap snaps shut, immediately finding itself assigned a 45-kilometer defensive sector, triple the frontage military doctrine recommends for its strength. Normal circumstances would require roughly 30,000 men to adequately defend this length of front. Eike has 8,000 combat effectives after 8 months of Eastern Front fighting. The mathematics are brutal: each kilometer of front defended by fewer than 200 soldiers, positions separated by gaps that Soviet infiltration units can exploit, defensive depth measured in single trench lines rather than multiple fallback positions. Theodor Eicke's response to the encirclement reveals both his military evolution and his unchanging core. A year earlier, as concentration camp inspector, he understood only dominance through overwhelming force against helpless opponents. 8 months in Russia, watching his division bleed through summer advances, autumn rain, and winter's arrival, have taught him defensive warfare's requirements. But his fundamental psychology remains unchanged. Retreat equals weakness, survival demands aggression even when surrounded, and will trumps material circumstances. When Wehrmacht commanders within the pocket discuss possible breakout attempts or strategic withdrawal, Eike refuses to participate. His division will hold its sector regardless of odds, casualties, or rational military assessment. This decision echoes Hitler's Halt Befehl, stand fast order, that will doom German forces across the Eastern Front. But at Demyansk in winter 1942, the tactic will paradoxically work. The first weeks of encirclement test every aspect of the Totenkopf division's character. Soviet forces probe constantly, seeking weak points in German defenses, identifying positions vulnerable to assault. The division's soldiers learn to fight at night in temperatures that freeze exposed skin within minutes, to man positions through artillery bombardments that last hours, to survive on food and ammunition dropped by overstretched Luftwaffe supply aircraft. The cold becomes enemy as dangerous as Soviet attacks. Frostbite claims soldiers who fall asleep in exposed positions. Weapons freeze and require constant maintenance to remain functional. Vehicles refuse to start without fires built beneath engines. Medical facilities become morgues, as wounded soldiers die from exposure before their injuries can be treated. The death's head insignia that once intimidated concentration camp prisoners means nothing to Russian winter. February 20th brings the crisis that will define the pocket's defense. Soviet forces mass for major assault on Totenkopf positions, concentrating artillery and armor against a 5-kilometer sector. The bombardment lasts 6 hours, destroying prepared positions and killing hundreds of defending soldiers. Then Soviet infantry, supported by T-34 tanks, surge forward in human waves that Wehrmacht tactics manuals describe, but German soldiers seldom experience at such intensity. The defensive line breaks in 3 places. Soviet units penetrate up to 2 kilometers into German positions before counterattacks restore the front. The battle costs the Totenkopf division over 400 casualties in a single day, losses that would seem catastrophic, except they become routine. The division is learning that survival in encirclement requires accepting casualty rates that would break normal units' cohesion. Luftwaffe supply operations keep the pocket alive but barely. Transport aircraft, primarily Yonkers 52 Tremotors, fly through Soviet anti-aircraft fire and brutal weather to drop supplies via parachute or land at improvised airstrips within the pocket. The 65,000 tons of supplies delivered over 8 months sound impressive until divided among 96,000 trapped soldiers. The Totenkopf division sector receives approximately 12% of total supplies, proportional to its size but inadequate for its casualties and combat intensity. Soldiers learn to survive on fractions of normal rations, ammunition allocations, force choices, defend against this Soviet probe with machine gun fire, or conserve for larger attack tomorrow. Medical supplies run perpetually short, with morphine reserved for the most seriously wounded and antibiotics non-existent. The pocket becomes laboratory for studying human endurance under systematic deprivation. March 15th marks the winter's coldest day. Temperatures plunge to -40°C as Arctic air mass settles over northwestern Russia. Soldiers in Totenkopf positions spend hours motionless in trenches, unable to move without exposing themselves to Soviet snipers, unable to remain still without risking death from cold. Officers rotate men through warming bunkers in shifts, but there's never enough shelter for entire units. Some soldiers deliberately wound themselves, shooting through their own feet or hands, preferring evacuation and survival to freezing in trenches. The division's medical officers face impossible triage decisions: evacuate soldiers with relatively minor wounds, because scarce aircraft space means choosing who lives, or keep them in the pocket where infections and cold will likely kill them. The Totenkopf division begins this day with roughly 7,000 combat effectives. By nightfall, another 100 are dead or wounded. The mathematics of attrition are inexorable. Yet something remarkable emerges from this sustained horror. The Totenkopf division develops combat effectiveness that elite Wehrmacht formations envy. Soldiers who survive weeks of continuous combat internalize lessons that training can't teach, reading Soviet attack patterns, identifying vulnerable moments for counterattacks, coordinating instinctively with nearby units. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers become tactically sophisticated through necessity. Senior casualties promote 19-year-old corporals to platoon command, 23-year-old lieutenants to company leadership. These young leaders lack formal military education, but possess battlefield wisdom purchased through blood. They know which Soviet tactics presage major assaults versus probing attacks, how to maximize defensive positions' effectiveness, when to retreat slightly, rather than die defending every meter. This institutional knowledge accumulates in survivors' collective consciousness. Soviet intelligence assessments captured later in the war reveal how enemy forces viewed the Totenkopf division during Demyansk. NKVD reports describe Totenkopf soldiers as most dangerous German division due to their absolute refusal to surrender positions. Soviet commanders learn to expect fanatical resistance whenever reconnaissance identifies the death's head insignia. This reputation cuts both ways. Soviet forces concentrate disproportionate firepower against Totenkopf sectors, reasoning that breaking this division will shatter German morale in the pocket. Red Army soldiers receive political officer briefings describing SS as fascist fanatics deserving no mercy. This mutual demonization creates combat of exceptional brutality, Both sides fight with understanding that surrender means torture or execution. The Totenkopf Division's concentration camp origins and Barbarossa atrocities ensure Soviet soldiers view them as war criminals rather than honorable enemies. April 21st, 1942, German relief operation, codenamed Fall Ritter, finally breaks through Soviet encirclement, opening corridor into the Demyansk Pocket. The first Wehrmacht soldiers to reach Totenkopf positions are shocked by what they find. Survivors resemble walking corpses, emaciated from months of quarter rations, hollow-eyed from constant combat and sleep deprivation, many showing wounds inadequately treated weeks earlier. The division that entered the pocket in February, with 12,000 men, now musters 6,400 combat effectives. Casualties total 12,625 killed, wounded, or missing over 10 weeks. 85% casualty rate that should have destroyed the unit's cohesion. Yet the division remains tactically functional, maintains defensive positions, executes orders. Wehrmacht observers struggle to explain this resilience using conventional military framework. Ike's evacuation for medical treatment in late April reveals the cult of personality's role in the division's survival. His command style, demanding, brutal, personally courageous, created bonds between soldiers and commander that transcended rational military relationships. Soldiers endured impossible circumstances, partly because Ike shared their hardships, visited forward positions under fire, personally led counterattacks when situations became desperate. His departure demoralizes surviving troops who view his leadership as irreplaceable. Yet the division continues functioning, suggesting that institutional culture has become self-sustaining. The values Ike instilled, absolute refusal to yield ground, aggression regardless of circumstances, contempt for death, now exist independent of his physical presence. He created military formation that internalized his psychology, ensuring his influence persists beyond his direct command. The medal distribution following Demyansk illustrates how German military establishment views the Totenkopf Division's performance. 9 Knight's Crosses are awarded to Totenkopf soldiers for actions during the encirclement, the highest concentration of Germany's premier valor decoration relative to unit size. Recipients include company commanders who held positions against overwhelming odds, assault group leaders who executed counterattacks that restored broken defensive lines, and artillery observers who directed fire while isolated behind Soviet lines. These decorations represent military establishment's acknowledgement that, whatever moral objections Wehrmacht professionals harbor about SS ideology and criminality, the Totenkopf Division proved its combat value through extraordinary circumstances. Fanaticism, properly directed and supported with adequate weapons, produces military effectiveness. The price of Demyansk extends beyond casualty statistics to psychological and physical damage that will never fully heal. Survivors develop 1,000-yard stares that never completely fade, startle reflexes triggered by sudden noises decades after the war, nightmares replaying specific moments when death came within meters. Many suffer permanent cold weather injuries, frostbitten extremities that never regain full sensation, respiratory damage from breathing air cold enough to freeze lungs. But perhaps most significantly, Demyansk validates the Totenkopf Division's worldview. Officers and soldiers who questioned whether ideological fanaticism equaled military virtue receive apparent confirmation. The division that refused retreat, that accepted catastrophic casualties, that maintained aggression despite encirclement, survived. Wehrmacht units that retreated strategically or surrendered when surrounded suffered destruction or captivity. The lesson seems clear, though it's dangerously false that will alone determines outcomes. The division's artillery regiment during Demyansk provides microcosm of adaptation under extreme constraints. Beginning the encirclement with 48 functioning guns, the regiment ends May with 8 operational pieces, the rest destroyed by Soviet counter-battery fire, abandoned when prime movers froze, or cannibalized for parts to keep remaining guns functional. Yet these 8 guns fire over 10,000 rounds during the pocket's final months, shifting constantly between positions to avoid Soviet targeting, coordinating with infantry commanders to provide support at critical moments. Crews learn to perform maintenance in darkness to avoid observation, to move guns using soldiers as draft animals when vehicles fail, to aim using improvised techniques when sights break. This desperate improvisation becomes standard procedure, with junior soldiers developing technical skills normally requiring months of training. By October 1942, when Wehrmacht forces finally evacuate the Demyansk salient in strategic withdrawal, the Totenkopf division has been essentially destroyed and reborn. Of the 12,000 men who entered the pocket in February, fewer than 3,000 remain with the division. Most are casualties. Some are evacuated wounded, others transferred to hospital units or training commands. But those 3,000 survivors represent core of institutional knowledge and combat experience that make the division infinitely more capable than its original formation. They've internalized lessons about defensive warfare, winter combat, coordination under extreme pressure. They've developed absolute confidence in their ability to survive impossible circumstances, and they've validated in their own minds the ideology that brought them to this place, believing that fanaticism and will accomplished what conventional military logic deemed impossible. The survivors are right about their capabilities, but dangerously wrong about the conclusions they draw. Demyansk proved that ideological soldiers could endure incredible hardship. It didn't prove that such hardship served strategic purpose, or that suffering justified the atrocities committed before and after. The Totenkopf division emerges from winter hell as one of Wehrmacht's most experienced formations. What it will do with that experience in Ukraine, at Kharkov, during Kursk, will demonstrate that combat effectiveness and war crimes aren't contradictory. They're complementary expressions of the same institutional character. June 22, 1941. The Totenkopf division crosses the Soviet border as part of Army Group North's massive assault into the Baltic states. The pre-dawn darkness explodes with artillery fire, thousands of guns firing simultaneously, creating artificial dawn that illuminates German infantry advancing behind armor spearheads. Within hours, Soviet border defenses collapse under coordinated assault that Wehrmacht planning has perfected through campaigns in Poland and France. But Operation Barbarossa differs from previous invasions in ways immediately apparent to Totenkopf soldiers. Commissar order, distributed days before crossing, authorizes immediate execution of Communist Party officials and political officers. Instructions regarding civilian populations, especially Jews, make explicit that ideological enemies receive no protection under military law. The Totenkopf division is entering not just war, but racial extermination campaign, and the skills developed in concentration camps will prove as valuable as any tactical training. The first atrocity occurs within hours of crossing the border, establishing patterns that will define the division's conduct throughout Barbarossa. Elements of Totenkopf Reconnaissance Battalion capture a Soviet commissar trying to organize partisan resistance near the border village of Tarragon. Standard military procedure would involve intelligence interrogation, followed by prisoner of war processing. Instead, Totenkopf soldiers execute the commissar immediately, along with 3 local Communist Party officials and 17 Jewish men identified during house-to-house searches. The executions are methodical. Victims march to a ravine outside the village, forced to kneel, shot in the back of the head. Totenkopf soldiers perform these killings without apparent emotional distress, applying skills practiced for years in concentration camp environments. The transition from guarding imprisoned enemies of the state to executing civilians in occupied territory proves seamless. June 30th, 1941 brings the Zubariv massacre, the Totenkopf division's most documented early atrocity in Ukraine. The division's 2nd Battalion occupies this small town after brief fighting with retreating Soviet forces. That evening, partisans, likely Red Army stragglers or NKVD stay-behind units, attack a Totenkopf supply column, killing 6 soldiers and destroying several vehicles. The partisan attack triggers immediate, overwhelming retaliation. Battalion commander orders house-to-house searches identifying all Jewish residents, easily accomplished because local Ukrainian collaborators eagerly identify their Jewish neighbors. Between 600 and 800 Jews are assembled in the town square, marched to anti-tank ditches outside the town, and machine-gunned. The entire operation takes less than 4 hours. Survivors who feign death and escape later testify that Totenkopf soldiers showed no hesitation, no debate about orders, no apparent moral conflict. They executed civilians with the efficiency of men performing familiar tasks. The Zubariv massacre reveals the connection between concentration camp training and battlefield atrocities. The Totenkopf soldiers conducting the killing had spent years learning that Jewish prisoners were subhuman, that violence against them was justified service to the state, that mass death was administrative procedure rather than moral crisis. Transferring these lessons from Dachau to Ukraine required no psychological adjustment, merely different geography. The skills remained identical, assembling victims efficiently, marching them to killing sites, executing them systematically, disposing of bodies in mass graves. Wehrmacht soldiers, who occasionally witness these massacres and report them to superior officers, express shock at the casual brutality. Totenkopf soldiers view such reactions as weakness, evidence that regular army lacks the ideological commitment necessary for racial war. Combat operations during late June and July proceed simultaneously with atrocities, the division functioning as both military formation and mobile killing unit. Tactically, the Totenkopf advances impressively through the Baltic states, covering over 450 kilometers in 6 weeks, pace faster than many Wehrmacht divisions, despite conducting frequent anti-partisan operations. The division's combat performance shows marked improvement from France. Better reconnaissance prevents ambushes, improved combined arms coordination reduces friendly fire incidents, officers demonstrate greater tactical sophistication. But this military professionalism coexists with systematic criminality. Units advance during the day, committing massacres at night. Soldiers fight Red Army forces in the morning, execute Jewish civilians in the afternoon. The dual functionality becomes routine, neither role interfering with the other. July 14th. The Battle of Luga demonstrates the division's conventional military capabilities when ideology doesn't dictate tactics. Soviet forces have established strong defensive positions along the Luga River, blocking German advance toward Leningrad. The Totenkopf division receives orders to break through fortified positions that have stalled other Wehrmacht units for days. The assault combines artillery bombardment, armor exploitation of weak points, and infantry follow-through using flamethrowers and grenades to clear bunkers. The division penetrates Soviet defenses in 2 days of intense fighting, suffering significant casualties but achieving operational breakthrough. Wehrmacht commanders observing the assault note the division's improved tactical competence compared to France. Officers coordinate fires effectively. Soldiers assault fortifications with discipline rather than just fanaticism. The Totenkopf is becoming genuinely elite combat formation, not merely ideologically motivated thugs in uniform. Yet August brings documented evidence of how combat frustration triggers atrocity. Soviet defensive lines along the approaches to Leningrad prove more formidable than German intelligence predicted. The Red Army fights with desperation, knowing that retreat means abandoning their second largest city. Totenkopf units suffering casualties from Soviet artillery, encountering minefields and prepared positions, respond by intensifying violence against civilian populations. Villages suspected of harboring partisans burn, their inhabitants executed without investigation. Jewish communities face automatic destruction, regardless of any military justification. Captured Soviet soldiers, especially those identified as commissars or Communist Party members, face execution rather than prisoner of war processing. The division's casualty rate correlates directly with its atrocity rate. Weeks of heavy combat produce weeks of intensive massacres, as if violence against defenseless civilians compensates for frustration against armed enemies. Wehrmacht intelligence intercepts Soviet communications during this period, revealing how Red Army units view SS formations. Soviet commanders warn troops that SS soldiers take no prisoners, that capture by units displaying the death's head insignia means torture and execution. Political officers use Totenkopf atrocities as proof of fascist barbarism, motivating Soviet resistance by emphasizing that surrender offers no safety. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Totenkopf violence convinces Soviet soldiers to fight to the death rather than surrender. Their fanatical resistance frustrates German advances and causes casualties. Those casualties trigger further Totenkopf atrocities. Wehrmacht officers recognize this dynamic, some submitting reports noting that SS conduct actually strengthens Soviet will to resist. These objections disappear into military bureaucracy, dismissed by SS leadership as defeatism and by Wehrmacht high command as inconvenient observations about useful formations. The interaction between Totenkopf units and Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads tasked with murdering Jews and communist officials, reveals the SS's coordinated approach to ideological warfare. Einsatzgruppe A operating in Army Group North's rear areas, frequently requests Totenkopf security and logistical support for mass executions. The division provides guards to cordon killing sites, transportation for victims, occasionally soldiers to supplement execution squads when volume of killing exceeds Einsatzgruppen manpower. At least 12 documented instances exist of Totenkopf units providing direct support for mass shootings of thousands of Jews. These operations aren't aberrations, they're formal coordination between two SS organizations with complementary missions. The Totenkopf fights the Red Army. The Einsatzgruppen murders civilian populations. Both serve the same racial war. October 15th, 1941 brings documentary evidence that eliminates any possibility of claiming Totenkopf atrocities resulted from unauthorized actions by rogue soldiers. Theodor Eicke issues written order to all battalion and company commanders: prisoners are only a burden, shoot on capture unless intelligence value. This order explicitly violates military law, even under Wehrmacht's already compromised standards for Eastern Front conduct. It transforms official division policy into war crimes mandate. Officers receiving this order face clear choice: obey and commit crimes, or refuse and face relief from command and possible court-martial. The overwhelming majority obey, not because Eicke's order surprises them, but because it formalizes practices already routine. The division's institutional culture has made murder policy, with documentation trail leading directly to its commander. Wehrmacht Corps commanders who have Totenkopf division attached to their formations submit increasingly critical reports during fall 1941. Multiple generals request the division's removal from their command, citing excesses that undermine military discipline and incidents that complicate relations with occupied populations. These carefully worded complaints avoid explicit accusations of war crimes. Naming specific atrocities might require follow-up investigations that would embarrass the German military establishment. But the pattern is clear. Professional officers view Totenkopf conduct as liability, despite acknowledging the division's combat effectiveness. The SS formation fights well, but leaves trails of corpses that create partisan resistance and burden occupation administration. Wehrmacht leadership faces uncomfortable reality. The most ideologically committed SS divisions are also the most tactically capable and the most criminally brutal. Separating these characteristics proves impossible because they emerge from identical institutional culture. By December 1941, as Germany advanced toward Leningrad stalls and winter approaches, preliminary tallies of Totenkopf atrocities during Barbarossa's first 6 months reveal the scale of criminality. Documented massacres include Zborov, Minsk suburbs, Krupki, and Artemovsk, totaling at least 3,400 civilian deaths, directly attributable to division units. This number reflects only documented, witnessed massacres with surviving testimony. The actual toll certainly exceeds documented cases by factors impossible to calculate: massacres in remote villages, executions during mobile operations, killings concealed by subsequent combat operations. Soviet Extraordinary Commission investigations after the war will attempt comprehensive accounting, but chaos of warfare and deliberate German efforts to destroy evidence make exact numbers unknowable. What remains certain: the Totenkopf division killed thousands of civilians during Barbarossa, systematically and deliberately. The division's combat performance during the same period complicates any simple narrative of SS formations as militarily incompetent fanatics. The Totenkopf advanced deeper and faster than many Wehrmacht divisions, broke through fortified Soviet defenses other units couldn't penetrate, maintained cohesion during difficult fighting. The division's casualty rate, approximately 35% over 6 months, indicates intense combat rather than cautious rear area operations. Soldiers earned valor decorations for genuine courage under fire. Officers demonstrated growing tactical sophistication. The formation proved itself capable of complex military operations. Wehrmacht after-action reports grudgingly acknowledge that ideological fanaticism, whatever its moral failures, produces soldiers willing to accept casualties that would break less committed units. The death's head symbol marks soldiers who excel at both conventional warfare and systematic murder. Winter's approach brings dual crisis, intensifying cold and hardening Soviet resistance. The Totenkopf division, like all German forces, enters winter 1941 unprepared for sustained operations in Russian cold. Soldiers lack proper winter clothing, vehicles lack antifreeze for extreme temperatures, weapons freeze without constant maintenance. Simultaneously, Soviet forces transition from chaotic retreat to organized defense, launching counteroffensives that catch German units unprepared for enemy initiative. The Totenkopf finds itself fighting defensive battles in conditions it never trained for, suffering frostbite casualties approaching combat losses, attempting to maintain positions across fronts that stretch resources impossibly thin. The division that committed atrocities while advancing victoriously now discovers that winning doesn't exempt soldiers from winter's brutality or Soviet artillery's impersonal violence. The question hanging over the Totenkopf division, as 1941 ends, is whether atrocities were strategic liabilities or enhancements to combat effectiveness. Wehrmacht critics argue that SS brutality created partisan movements, stiffened Soviet resistance, and complicated occupation governance. They claim that conventional military conduct would have produced strategic advantages, cooperative populations, prisoners providing intelligence, reduced partisan activity. The SS perspective inverts this logic. Brutal repression prevents resistance from organizing, summary execution eliminates future threats. Terror pacifies populations more effectively than benevolent occupation. Both arguments contain partial truth and total moral failure. The strategic debate over atrocities' effectiveness ignores the fundamental reality that mass murder violates elementary human decency, regardless of tactical outcomes. The Totenkopf division's conduct during Barbarossa demonstrates that soldiers can be simultaneously brave and criminal, tactically effective and morally depraved, skilled in combat and enthusiastic participants in genocide. These contradictions aren't aberrations requiring explanation. They're the logical product of an institution that treated concentration camp guard duty as preparation for military service. The death's head symbol revealed its true meaning in Russia, not warrior pride, but the machinery of death, mechanized and indiscriminate, consuming enemy soldiers and innocent civilians with equal industrial efficiency. October 19th, 1942. A trainload of survivors from the Demyansk Pocket arrives at reforming camps in southwestern France. The men shuffling onto the platform at Bordeaux bear little resemblance to the confident soldiers who invaded Russia 16 months earlier. They're gaunt from months of inadequate rations, hollow-eyed from continuous combat and winter's brutal siege. Many carry visible wounds inadequately healed, missing fingers from frostbite, limps from shrapnel injuries, scars from burns. Of the 21,000 men who originally formed the Totenkopf division in 1939, fewer than 3,000 remain with the unit. The death's head insignia that once marked concentration camp guards has been transformed into badge of survival through hell. But these survivors represent something more valuable than manpower. Their institutional memory, combat veterans whose experience will now propagate through rebuilt division, receiving modern equipment and fresh soldiers. Hermann Priess, commanding the division in Theodor Eicke's medical absence, faces challenges more complex than the original 1939 formation. Then Eicke transformed concentration camp guards into soldiers with questionable effectiveness. Now, Priess must integrate traumatized veterans with teenage replacements, while simultaneously converting the division from infantry to Panzer Grenadier, mechanized infantry formation, equipped with tanks and armored vehicles. The new recruits arriving in November present their own complications. Most are 17-year-old Hitler-Jugend members, whose propaganda education has prepared them for glorious service, but not for the broken men whose combat experience they're supposed to absorb. The veterans in turn view fresh recruits with mixture of contempt and protectiveness, disdain for their naivety, combined with desire to impart survival lessons. The generational and experiential divide within the reforming division creates toxic dynamics that replicate concentration camp hierarchies. Veterans, many now non-commissioned officers, despite being in their early 20s, treat recruits with brutality learned in camps and refined in combat. Physical punishment for mistakes becomes routine. Public humiliation for failures serves as teaching method. Recruits who complain about treatment face group retribution from veterans who believe that only harsh conditions prepare men for Russia's reality. Wehrmacht formations integrate replacements through structured training that gradually imparts institutional knowledge. The Totenkopf division integrates replacements through hazing that breaks individuality and forges conformity through shared suffering. This method produces cohesion. Recruits who survive the integration process develop fierce loyalty to their units. but it also propagates institutional culture that treats cruelty as normal, necessary, even virtuous. December 1942 through January 1943 brings equipment transformation that represents quantum leap in the division's capabilities. The hodgepodge of Czech and captured weapons that equipped the original formation gives way to modern German production. The newly formed tank battalion receives 104 Panzer IIIs and 4s medium tanks with 7.5 cm guns capable of engaging Soviet armor on equal terms. 35 Stug assault guns provide mobile firepower for direct infantry support. Most revolutionary, the infantry battalions trade their trucks and marching boots for Schützenpanzerwagen, armored half-track personnel carriers that protect soldiers during advances and increase mobility dramatically. This mechanization transforms tactical possibilities. The division can now conduct rapid exploitation operations, maintain pace with armor spearheads, execute combined arms maneuvers requiring precise coordination between tanks, infantry, and artillery. But equipment alone doesn't create effective mechanized formation. Crews and infantry must master technical skills and tactical doctrine. Training at Paderborn Proving Grounds during winter 1942-43 focuses on combined arms operations that the division attempted crudely in France and Russia. Tank crews practice coordinating with infantry fighting from half-tracks, learning to advance together rather than independently. Infantry soldiers train to dismount under fire, using their vehicles' protection until the final assault phase. Artillery observers practice directing fire from moving vehicles, adjusting to fluid battlefield conditions. These exercises proceed with less brutality than Ike's Bordeaux training, Priest lacks Ike's charismatic dominance, and compensates with greater professionalism. He's still SS officer shaped by concentration camp service, but his command style emphasizes competence over ideology, tactical excellence over fanatical will. The veteran stories, shared during evening hours in barracks, educate recruits more effectively than any formal instruction. They describe Demyansk's endless cold Soviet human wave attacks that continued despite catastrophic casualties, artillery barrages that lasted hours, the smell of burning flesh from flamethrower attacks on bunkers. These aren't glory stories, they're survival testimonies. Veterans explain which Soviet weapons to fear most, how to distinguish artillery types by sound, where to position bodies to use corpses as sandbags when fortifying positions. Recruits listen with expressions oscillating between horror and fascination. The propaganda that brought them to SS service emphasized heroic sacrifice and racial struggle. The veteran's testimony emphasizes pragmatic adaptation and random death. This contradiction between ideological narrative and combat reality creates cognitive dissonance that the division's culture resolves through reframing. Survival itself becomes proof of racial superiority, suffering becomes evidence of worthiness. Casualty rates validate rather than question the mission. February 1943 brings orders deploying the reconstituted division to Ukraine, where German forces are desperately attempting to stabilize fronts collapsing after Stalingrad's disaster. The Totenkopf division boards trains carrying roughly 17,000 men, the 3,000 Demyansk survivors now forming core cadre for 14,000 replacements. This reconstituted division differs fundamentally from the original formation. 82% of personnel are new since 1939, most having never experienced combat. But tactical sophistication and equipment quality exceed anything the division previously possessed. The tank battalion alone contains more firepower than the entire original formation. Infantry battalions riding in armored half-tracks can maneuver with speed and protection impossible for foot infantry. Artillery regiments' standardized German guns can deliver accurate, sustained fire support. The question facing the division is whether this combination of inexperienced personnel and modern equipment can replicate or exceed the combat effectiveness purchased so expensively at Demyansk. Freeze's command style during the division's transit to Ukraine reveals the evolution of Totenkopf leadership. Unlike Ike's cult of personality, Freeze emphasizes professional military standards. He mandates that officers study Wehrmacht tactical manuals rather than rely solely on SS doctrine. He encourages subordinates to propose alternative approaches rather than demanding unquestioning obedience. He treats tactical failures as learning opportunities rather than occasions for punishment. These changes alarm some concentration camp veterans who view professional military culture as corrupting SS ideological purity, but Freeze's approach produces measurable improvements. Coordination between units improves, planning becomes more sophisticated, junior officers demonstrate initiative rather than waiting for explicit orders. The Totenkopf division is becoming more militarily effective while potentially becoming less ideologically extreme, though this moderation remains relative and shouldn't be mistaken for actual morality. The division's arrival in Ukraine during late February coincides with Field Marshal von Manstein preparation for his Kharkov counteroffensive, the last German strategic success on the Eastern Front. The Totenkopf joins two other SS divisions, Leibstandart and Das Reich, forming SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hausser's Paul-Hauser command. This concentration of elite formations receives premier role in the coming offensive, exploiting breakthroughs achieved by Wehrmacht armor, encircling Soviet forces overextended by their post-Stalingrad advances, recapturing Kharkov and stabilizing the southern front. The Totenkopf division will finally fight as its designation suggests, mechanized formation conducting mobile warfare rather than infantry slogging through Russia's mud and snow. The upcoming battle will test whether equipment and training have transformed the division into genuine elite formation, or merely created more expensive way to repeat previous patterns of tactical aggression and strategic criminality. March opens with the offensive's beginning, and the Totenkopf immediately demonstrates its transformed capabilities. Tank companies advance at speeds impossible for the old Czech panzers. Panzer IV's 7.5 cm guns engaging Soviet T-34 tanks on favorable terms. Infantry battalions, mounted in armored half-tracks, maintain pace with armor and deploy rapidly when encountering resistance. Artillery batteries displace forward aggressively, providing continuous support rather than lagging behind advances. The coordination that looked so ragged in France and Russia now appears seamless. Tanks suppress enemy positions, infantry assaults, artillery shifts fires to next objectives. Wehrmacht commanders, observing SS Corps operations, grudgingly acknowledge that Waffen-SS divisions are mastering combined arms warfare that regular army formations pioneered. Yet beneath tactical competence, institutional culture remains fundamentally unchanged. The division advancing into Ukraine still contains officers who served as concentration camp guards, non-commissioned officers who participated in Barbarossa massacres, institutional memory that treats atrocity as normal wartime conduct. The recruits who comprise 82% of the division have been indoctrinated by veterans whose stories normalize war crimes, who frame Soviet civilians as legitimate targets, who view brutality as necessary rather than criminal. Equipment doesn't determine institutional character, culture does. The Totenkopf division rolling into Ukraine with modern tanks and armored vehicles brings the same values that governed its conduct since 1939: contempt for military law, dehumanization of enemies, willingness to commit atrocities when circumstances provide opportunity or frustration demands outlet. Theodor Ike, still recovering from his Demyansk wounds at a Bavarian medical facility, monitors his division's performance through official reports and personal correspondence with loyal subordinates. His absence from command hasn't diminished his influence. The division remains fundamentally his creation, its values reflecting his psychology, its institutional culture propagating his vision of ideological soldiers. But IK recognizes that Priest's professional approach produces results. The division is achieving objectives with lower casualty rates than during IK's command, fighting more effectively while suffering less dramatically. This creates tension in IK's thinking. Does professional military leadership vindicate Wehrmacht critics who argued that ideology undermines effectiveness, or does the division's success under Priest merely reflect foundational work IK completed through brutal training and combat experience? IK resolves this cognitive dissonance predictably. The division succeeds because he built it, because his values shaped its character, because his methods created soldiers whom competent commanders can effectively employ. The reformed Totenkopf division entering the Kharkov battle in March 1943 represents synthesis of contradictory elements: concentration camp brutality and professional military competence, ideological fanaticism and tactical sophistication, war crime-prone institutional culture, and modern mechanized warfare capabilities. This combination will prove devastatingly effective in conventional combat operations. It will also produce some of the Eastern Front's most documented atrocities, demonstrating that military effectiveness and moral depravity aren't opposing qualities, but complementary aspects of institutions designed to excel at ideological warfare. The Death's Head symbol, now marking panzer turrets and half-track hulls, advertises both the division's combat capabilities and its criminal character. Kharkov will validate the first characteristic spectacularly. It will also confirm the second with documentary evidence that will haunt survivors into the post-war decades. March 11th, 1943. The Totenkopf Division's Panzer Battalion leads SS Panzer Corps' assault on Kharkov from the south, tank commanders navigating through suburbs, transformed into rubble by months of fighting. The Soviet 69th Army holds the city with approximately 40,000 troops, occupying fortified positions among apartment blocks and industrial facilities. This urban terrain negates many advantages of mobile warfare. Tanks become vulnerable to close-range anti-tank weapons. Infantry must clear buildings room by room. Artillery fire risks hitting friendly forces in adjacent structures. Yet Totenkopf's units advance steadily, demonstrating that the previous year's training and equipment transformation have created formation genuinely capable of complex operations. The upcoming week will see the division's finest military performance and its most concentrated period of documented atrocities. The approach to Kharkov reveals tactical sophistication absent from the division's earlier operations. Rather than attempting direct frontal assault on Soviet positions, Totenkopf armor probes for weak points in defensive lines, identifying gaps between Soviet units and seams in their coordination. When reconnaissance locates vulnerable sectors, panzer companies concentrate firepower, while infantry in half-tracks exploit breakthroughs. This methodical approach contrasts sharply with the division's previous tendency toward aggressive but poorly coordinated attacks. Priest's command style and the veterans' accumulated experience have produced force that combines SS aggression with Wehrmacht tactical intelligence. Soviet defenders, expecting fanatical but predictable SS attacks, instead face coordinated combined arms operations that identify and exploit their defensive weaknesses. March 13th brings the tank battle at Olsony, 9 kilometers southwest of Kharkov, where Totenkopf armor encounters major Soviet tank formation attempting to reinforce the city's defenders. The engagement lasts 6 hours, ranging across open ground where Panzer IV's superior optics and crew training proved decisive advantages. Soviet T-34 tanks possess better armor and armament than German medium tanks, but Totenkopf crews demonstrate gunnery skills and tactical coordination that overcome technical inferiority. German tanks advance in mutually supporting pairs, each covering the other's movements. Soviet tanks attack in larger groups, but with less coordination, making them vulnerable to concentrated fire. By engagement's end, 47 Soviet tanks burn across the battlefield. The Totenkopf loses 11 panzers, favorable exchange ratio that Wehrmacht armor commanders respect and envy. This success validates months of training and demonstrates that SS formations, properly equipped and professionally led, can match elite Wehrmacht units in conventional combat. The transition to urban fighting tests different skills as Totenkopf units enter Kharkov's outskirts on March 14th. City combat eliminates many mechanized warfare advantages. Tanks become vulnerable to infantry with anti-tank weapons fired from buildings. Armored vehicles can't maneuver freely on rubble-blocked streets. Artillery support risks friendly fire casualties. But Totenkopf infantry demonstrate adaptations learned through previous urban fighting. They form Sturmgruppen assault groups, combining infantry, engineers with flamethrowers and explosives, and close support armor. These teams clear buildings systematically, engineers blast entries through walls, infantry assault through the breaches, while flamethrowers suppress defenders, tanks position to provide covering fire. The tactics mirror Wehrmacht methods developed during Stalingrad, but executed with characteristic SS aggression. Soviet defenders fight desperately, knowing that SS capture means likely execution, but coordination breaks down as German forces split defensive zones into isolated pockets. March 15th sees the division penetrate to Kharkov center, but this day also brings the massacre that will define the battle's moral character. The city's main hospital complex contains approximately 300 to 400 wounded Soviet soldiers and medical staff. Wehrmacht doctrine, even on the brutal Eastern Front, generally respects medical facilities as protected under international law, not from humanitarian concern, but from practical reciprocity, understanding that German wounded require similar protection. The Totenkopf Division's institutional culture recognizes no such constraints. Units clearing the hospital area systematically execute wounded Soviet soldiers in their beds, doctors attempting to protect patients, nurses trying to evacuate the most critical cases. The massacre proceeds methodically through multiple hospital buildings over several hours, suggesting organized rather than spontaneous violence. Survivors hiding in basement shelters report hearing systematic gunfire as Totenkopf soldiers moved floor to floor. The hospital massacre wasn't an isolated incident, but part of broader pattern during Kharkov's capture. Totenkopf units execute Soviet political officers discovered among prisoners, kill commissars identified by their uniforms or documents, murder wounded enemy soldiers too injured to walk. These killings follow explicit orders from Division Command. The same doctrine codified in October 1941, now implemented by Preze's command, despite his more professional approach. The combination of military competence and systematic atrocity reveals the division's fundamental character. Tactical excellence serves ideological goals. Professional military skills enable rather than constrain criminality. The officers coordinating combined arms operations against Soviet armor are the same officers authorizing execution of prisoners and wounded. These aren't contradictory roles, but complementary functions within institutional framework that treats conventional warfare and war crimes as aspects of the same ideological mission. March 18th marks Kharkov's complete capture, with Soviet forces either destroyed, captured, or withdrawn. The Totenkopf division can claim significant role in this victory, advancing 35 kilometers in 7 days of intense urban combat, destroying major Soviet tank formation, clearing fortified positions from defenders who fought desperately. The military achievement is genuine and impressive. The division demonstrated that it could conduct complex operations in difficult terrain against determined opposition. Casualty statistics validate tactical competence. Soviet losses exceeded 5,800 killed versus Totenkopf casualties around 1,100, 5-to-1 exchange ratio, considered excellent in urban warfare. Wehrmacht commanders observing SS Corps operations acknowledge that Waffen-SS divisions have matured into formations comparable to the Army's best units. Yet, simultaneous with military success, comes documentation of war crimes that will eventually support post-war prosecutions. Soviet Extraordinary Commission investigators, arriving in Kharkov after the city's eventual liberation, discover mass graves containing hospital massacre victims, execution sites where prisoners were killed in groups, evidence of systematic rather than random violence. Witness testimony from surviving medical personnel, civilians who observed executions, and occasional Soviet soldiers who escaped killing details creates comprehensive picture of Totenkopf criminality. This documentation differs from Barbarossa atrocities that often lacked surviving witnesses or occurred in remote locations. Kharkov massacres happened in major city with civilian population that survived to testify. The evidence trail leading to Totenkopf division is unambiguous and will prove crucial in post-war trials. The medal distribution following Kharkov demonstrates German military establishment's willingness to reward SS combat effectiveness, despite knowing about atrocities. 12 Totenkopf soldiers received Knight's Crosses for actions during the battle, including company commanders who led successful assaults, tank commanders who destroyed numerous Soviet vehicles, and battalion officers who coordinated complex operations. Hermann Priest receives Oakleaf's addition to his Knight's Cross, recognizing his command performance. These decorations represent military systems' acknowledgement that Totenkopf combat value outweighs moral concerns about SS conduct. Wehrmacht officers privately express disgust at SS atrocities, but they accept SS divisions' contributions to military operations and reward individual valor. This moral compartmentalization, treating combat performance as separate from war crimes, enables the German military to utilize ideologically extreme formations while maintaining pretense of professional conduct. The soldier's perspective on Kharkov, revealed through letters and post-war testimony, shows how institutional culture frames atrocities as necessary rather than criminal. Veterans describe hospital killings as eliminating Soviet soldiers who would return to combat if allowed to recover, framing murder of wounded as military expedients. They characterize execution of commissars and political officers as eliminating dangerous ideological enemies, not as violation of prisoner of war protections. The division's internal narrative treats these actions as unfortunate necessities of ideological warfare, tactical decisions rather than moral failures. This framing demonstrates how institutional culture shapes individual moral reasoning. When organization defines atrocity as duty, soldiers commit crimes while viewing themselves as following legitimate orders and serving necessary purposes. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Kharkov represent genuine military achievement worth examining separate from moral evaluation. The Panzer Grenadier teams clearing urban positions developed techniques that balance speed with survivability, using armor as mobile cover for infantry, employing flamethrowers to suppress defenders before assaults, coordinating artillery and direct fire to isolate objectives before attacking. These methods reduced casualties while maintaining offensive momentum, military professionals' perennial challenge in urban warfare. Wehrmacht units observed and adopted some of these techniques, acknowledging that SS divisions' willingness to accept risks during innovation sometimes produced tactically valuable results. The Totenkopf division's combat effectiveness at Kharkov represents institutional learning from previous failures, incorporation of professional military methods, and maturation of leadership beyond purely ideological motivation. But this professional maturation never displaced the division's criminal character. It merely made the criminality more efficient. Officers who planned sophisticated combined arms operations also organized systematic executions. Soldiers who demonstrated tactical discipline during combat abandoned all restraint when dealing with prisoners and civilians. The institutional culture that valued combat effectiveness equally valued ideological ruthlessness, treating both as necessary characteristics of superior soldiers. Kharkov demonstrated that training and equipment could transform Totenkopf division into elite military formation. It also demonstrated that such transformation didn't moderate the division's war crime-prone behavior. If anything, increased competence enabled more systematic atrocities. The question emerging from Kharkov is whether military establishment could have separated combat effectiveness from criminality by imposing external constraints on SS divisions. Wehrmacht commanders possessed authority to court-martial SS soldiers for war crimes, could have demanded SS unit removal from their commands, might have reported atrocities through official channels rather than ignoring them. The failure to impose such constraints reflects German military leadership's moral compromise. They valued SS combat contributions more than they opposed SS criminality. This calculation enabled formations like Totenkopf to function as hybrid military criminal organizations, receiving recognition for battlefield achievements, while facing no accountability for atrocities. The death's head symbol marked soldiers who could be simultaneously decorated for valor and guilty of murder, contradictions that German military system accepted as unavoidable costs of ideological warfare. By April 1943, as spring mud brings temporary pause to major operations, the Totenkopf division consolidates positions around Kharkov with satisfied assessment of its performance. Officers view the battle as validation. The division proved it could conduct mobile warfare, urban combat, and complex combined arms operations successfully. Soldiers take pride in their combat achievements, viewing themselves as elite warriors proven through difficult fighting. Division's internal culture interprets Kharkov as triumph over Wehrmacht skeptics, vindication of SS military value, evidence that ideological soldiers can equal or surpass regular army formations. But this self-congratulatory narrative ignores or dismisses the atrocities that accompanied military success, treating war crimes as either necessary tactics or regrettable byproducts of intense combat, rather than institutional failures requiring reform. The Totenkopf division leaves Kharkov more confident in its capabilities, more secure in its elite status, and completely unchanged in its willingness to commit atrocities when circumstances provide opportunity. The combination of professional military competence and systematic criminality that defined Kharkov performance will characterize the division's conduct through remaining 2 years of war. Excellence in combat and enthusiasm for murder weren't contradictory characteristics, they were complementary expressions of institutional character, forged in concentration camps and refined through years of ideological warfare. July 5, 1943. The Totenkopf division. The Totenkopf division advances through pre-dawn darkness as part of Operation T.C. Tar Dele Citadel, Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. Artillery preparation has been underway for hours, thousands of guns attempting to shatter Soviet defenses around the Kursk salient. Tank engines roar, as panzer companies move forward, accompanied by infantry in half-tracks and engineers prepared to clear minefields. Theodore Eicke returned to command after medical recovery, rides in command, vehicle monitoring reports from forward units. Initial resistance seems lighter than anticipated, Soviet forward positions yielding to German assault. But within hours, as the division penetrates deeper, the trap's design becomes apparent. Soviet defenders have constructed defensive belts extending 60 kilometers deep, containing layer upon layer of minefields, anti-tank positions, fortified strongpoints, and reserve formations positioned for counterattacks. The Totenkopf division is about to experience the Red Army's evolution from desperate defender to sophisticated opponent. The first day's advance covers only 8 kilometers despite massive German superiority in local force concentration. Soviet defensive tactics have evolved dramatically from 1941's chaotic retreats. Anti-tank positions wait until German armor closes to point-blank range before opening fire, maximizing penetration chances. Infantry remain concealed in prepared positions rather than exposing themselves prematurely. Artillery remains silent during German bombardments, preserving guns for counterfire during actual assaults. The Totenkopf encounters defense in depth that absorbs momentum rather than breaking under initial pressure. By nightfall, the division has lost 18 panzers to mines and anti-tank guns, suffered 300 casualties, and faces intact Soviet defenses ahead. Eich's aggressive command style, successful at Kharkov's exploitation phase, proves poorly suited to grinding through prepared defenses, where will alone doesn't overcome engineering and firepower. July 10th marks the battle's turning point as Soviet reserves commit to counteroffensives. The Totenkopf division, having advanced roughly 30 kilometers at enormous cost, suddenly faces T-34 attacks from directions previously assumed secured. Soviet tank forces appear in regimental strength, exploiting gaps in German lines, threatening encirclement of advanced German positions. The division's response demonstrates both its tactical competence and the limitations of that competence against numerically superior enemies. Tank companies execute fighting withdrawals, trading space for time, while inflicting casualties on pursuing Soviet armor. Infantry establishes hasty defensive positions, using terrain and prepared fire zones to channel Soviet attacks. Artillery provides responsive fire support, breaking up Soviet concentrations before they can overwhelm German positions. These professional military skills prevent catastrophe, but they can't produce victory. July 20th brings Hitler's cancellation of Citadel offensive as Western allies invade Sicily, and Germany requires forces for multiple fronts. The Totenkopf division has lost 46 panzers, suffered 1,570 casualties, and advanced then retreated across ground purchased with blood that achieved nothing strategic. The division's combat effectiveness impressed Wehrmacht observers. Totenkopf units consistently demonstrated tactical skill, coordination, and aggressive response to Soviet pressure. But effectiveness couldn't overcome fundamental strategic reality. Germany lacked resources to sustain attritional warfare against Soviet Union's massive manpower and industrial reserves. Kursk marked the end of German offensive capability in the east. From this point forward, the Totenkopf division would fight defensive battles, retrograde operations, desperate counterattacks attempting to slow inevitable Soviet advance. The fighting withdrawal through Ukraine from August 1943 through February 1944 imposes different demands than offensive operations. The division excels at mobile defense, conducting ambushes, delaying Soviet advances through terrain demolition, counterattacking when Soviet forces overextend their logistics. These operations showcase the division's matured capabilities. Officers coordinate complex movements, while maintaining cohesion. Junior leaders execute missions with minimal supervision. Soldiers fight effectively even when exhausted and outnumbered. But sustained defensive warfare produces steady attrition that even elite formations can't sustain indefinitely. Every engagement produces casualties, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, with replacement quality declining as Germany's manpower reserves diminish. The division's strength fluctuates between 8,000 and 12,000 men, as replacements partially offset losses, but veteran percentage steadily declines. April 1944 brings the Totenkopf Pocket, where Totenkopf Division participates in relief operation rescuing encircled Wehrmacht forces. The mission requires aggressive offensive through Soviet lines that have enveloped roughly 30,000 German soldiers. The division attacks in classic Panzer Corps style, concentrated armor breaching Soviet defenses, infantry exploiting breakthrough, rapid advance to link with surrounded forces before Soviets can reinforce. The operation succeeds, establishing corridor for encircled Germans to escape, and represents the Totenkopf Division's final offensive success. Tactically, the operation demonstrates that division retains capability for complex operations despite months of defensive fighting. Strategically, it changes nothing. Rescued German forces simply retreat further west, delaying but not preventing eventual Soviet advance. The division suffers over 800 casualties conducting operation that buys weeks at most before strategic situation deteriorates further. May 1944 brings orders transferring the division to France, where Allied invasion is expected. The movement west represents recognition of the Totenkopf Division's elite status. Hitler reserves his most trusted formations for crisis points, moving them between fronts to stabilize collapsing situations. But the division arriving in Normandy differs fundamentally from the formation that fought at Kharkov. 15,000 men fill the division's ranks, but only 37 panzers remain operational. Rest are in maintenance or awaiting spare parts. Personnel replacements increasingly include transfers from Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine, Air Force and Navy personnel with minimal infantry training assigned to ground combat as Germany desperately seeks manpower. Veterans of Russia, the survivors who remember Demyansk, Kharkov, Kursk, form shrinking minority, their institutional knowledge diluted by influx of inadequately trained replacements. June 6 brings Allied invasion of Normandy, with Totenkopf Division positioned inland from invasion beaches. The division's movement toward combat reveals how completely Allied air supremacy has altered warfare's fundamental dynamics. Daylight movement draws immediate attention from fighter bombers that strafe columns, destroying vehicles and forcing dispersal. Supply convoys traveling from rear areas to forward positions can move only at night, arriving exhausted after navigating roads cratered by bombing. Artillery positions face counter-battery fire within minutes of firing missions guided by aerial observation and radio interception. The division that fought in Russia with local air superiority now experiences what Soviet forces endured during Barbarossa: constant air attack, inability to mass forces, continuous attrition from weapons against which ground forces have limited defense. The fighting near Cannon during June and July imposes casualties the division can't sustain. British and Canadian forces attack with artillery concentrations exceeding anything on the Eastern Front, 1,000-gun bombardments that obliterate defensive positions, destroy communications, and inflict psychological damage equal to physical casualties. Allied armor enjoys numerical superiority and air support that devastates German counterattacks. The Totenkopf fights skillfully ambushing Allied tanks with well-positioned anti-tank guns, counterattacking to restore broken positions, defending hedgerow terrain that favors defenders. But skill can't overcome material disparity. For every Allied tank destroyed, 5 more appear. For every defensive position held, artillery bombardments render it untenable. The division bleeds away through constant combat, losing 5,400 men in 10 weeks of defensive fighting that achieves nothing except delaying Allied breakout by days or weeks. British intelligence identifies Totenkopf division through radio intercepts and prisoner interrogations, then prioritizes counter-battery fire and airstrikes against its positions. Allied commanders have learned that SS divisions defend tenaciously and require concentrated force to dislodge. This focus ensures the division receives disproportionate attention from Allied firepower, both recognition of its combat effectiveness and contribution to its rapid attrition. Wehrmacht divisions in adjacent sectors sometimes face lighter pressure than Totenkopf positions, ironically making the division's elite status liability rather than advantage. The death's head insignia that once intimidated concentration camp prisoners now marks units that Allied forces identify as priority targets. August brings Falaise pockets closing, Allied encirclement trapping substantial German forces in northwestern France. The Totenkopf division fights desperate actions attempting to hold escape routes open, then joins chaotic retreat toward German border. Organization collapses as units fragment under constant Allied pressure, supply system disintegrates, command and control becomes impossible beyond immediate visual range. The division that prided itself on discipline and cohesion reduces to scattered battle groups fighting independently, coordinating only when officers happen to encounter each other. By September, when surviving elements reach German frontier, the division requires complete rebuilding again. This will be the formation's third reconstitution, each time drawing from shallower manpower reserves, each time incorporating less qualified replacements, each time struggling to maintain standards that define elite status. Hitler's assessment during August 1944 that Totenkopf represents one of only 4 divisions he can rely on completely reveals the Führer's detachment from military reality. The division Hitler trusts has been reduced to divisional strength in name only, suffers from chronic equipment shortages, contains decreasing percentages of combat-experienced soldiers. But Hitler's perception reflects important truth. When Germany's military situation collapses, when commanders face impossible missions, when political considerations outweigh military judgment, SS divisions receive assignments because ideological loyalty matters more than tactical rationality. The Totenkopf moves repeatedly to crisis points not because it's most effective, but because Hitler trusts it won't question suicidal orders. This creates self-fulfilling prophecy. Assignment to desperate situations produces heavy casualties. Casualties dilute effectiveness. Reduced effectiveness necessitates assignment to sectors where determination matters more than competence. The combat experience from Kursk through Normandy transforms survivors' perspective in ways the division's ideology can't accommodate. Veterans who survived Demyansk believed suffering proved ideological superiority. That will alone explain survival. Veterans emerging from 1944's grinding defensive battles can't maintain such illusions. They've watched German offensive capability collapse, experienced overwhelming Soviet numerical superiority, endured Allied material advantages that made tactical skill irrelevant. The faith in German racial superiority that sustained morale during victories corrodes under defeat's accumulation. But institutional culture provides no framework for honest assessment. Admitting that ideology failed to guarantee victory means acknowledging that suffering was pointless, that comrades died for nothing, that the division's existence served criminal purposes rather than noble cause. Survivors can't psychologically afford such conclusions, so they retreat into smaller narratives, pride in tactical excellence, loyalty to immediate comrades, focus on surviving next engagement rather than contemplating war's larger meaning. The division's equipment situation by fall 1944 symbolizes Germany's industrial collapse. Panzer battalions, field mixture of German captured Soviet and obsolete Czech tanks, whatever can be scrounged from depots and repair facilities. Artillery regiments contain German, Soviet, American, and French guns, each requiring different ammunition and creating logistics nightmares. Infantry companies carry weapons from multiple nations, maintenance complicated by lack of standardized parts. This hodgepodge creates units that look impressive on organization charts but struggle with basic functionality. When tank breaks down, mechanics may lack spare parts. When artillery piece malfunctions, ammunition may not be available. The division that fought Kharkov with standardized modern equipment now operates with desperation's improvisation. By December 1944, as Germany prepares final offensive in the Ardennes, the Totenkopf division remains in Hungary, attempting to hold Budapest against Soviet encirclement. The division's exclusion from the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, indicates either that it's too depleted for offensive operations, or that Hungary's defense is considered equally critical. Either interpretation confirms the division's reduced status. The formation that once spearheaded major offensives now fights local defensive actions, moving between crisis points to delay inevitable defeat. Veterans who joined the division believing in German victory now fight knowing they're postponing collapse rather than achieving triumph. But institutional culture and organizational loyalty keep them fighting, not for Hitler's vision of racial empire, but for immediate survival and protection of comrades. The ideology that created the Totenkopf division has failed, but the bonds it forged between soldiers remain strong enough to sustain combat effectiveness even as strategic situation becomes hopeless. February 16th, 1945. The Totenkopf division occupies defensive positions southwest of Vienna, attempting to shield Austria's capital from Soviet Third Ukrainian Front advancing through Hungary. The division musters 4,300 combat effectives from authorized strength of 15,000 shortages, reflecting months of attrition and Germany's exhausted manpower reserves. Soldiers in the trenches range from Demyansk veterans in their mid-20s, now considered elderly by frontline standards, to 16-year-old boys conscripted from Hitler-Jugend, Hitler-Jugend, and given weeks of training before commitment. Tank Battalion operates 9 functioning panzers, 9 vehicles from a unit authorized over 100. Artillery fires rationed ammunition, forbidden from engaging targets unless attack appears imminent. Supply system has collapsed to point where divisions forage from local populations, requisitioning food and fuel that Austrian civilians need for survival. This isn't elite formation, it's desperate remnant, sustained by organizational inertia and soldiers' refusal to accept defeat. The defensive fighting through March and April demonstrates that tactical competence persists despite material collapse. Totenkopf's units conduct skillful retrograde operations, delaying Soviet advances through carefully planned ambushes and counterattacks. Officers coordinate complex withdrawals that preserve unit cohesion while avoiding encirclement. Veterans pass survival knowledge to replacements during brief pauses between engagements, which terrain provides best defensive positions, how to recognize Soviet attack preparations, when to withdraw versus when standing means destruction. But skill can't overcome disparities in firepower, numbers, and logistics. For every successful delay action, territory lost remains lost. For every Soviet tank destroyed, 10 more arrive. The division fights competently toward inevitable defeat. April 26, 1945 brings Theodore Eicke's death, ending that carries symbolic weight disproportionate to tactical significance. Eicke, commanding what remained of his division, travels in staff car between positions near Styr when Soviet Sturmovik aircraft strafe the road. Machine gun fire kills Eicke instantly, along with his driver and aide. His death by air attack, impersonal, random, the weapon he can't intimidate or command, mirrors the futility of Germany's final resistance. The man who built the concentration camp system, who transformed guards into soldiers, who created institutional culture, combining military professionalism with systematic criminality, dies in a ditch beside an Austrian road. His body receives hasty burial, no ceremony, minimal marking, location eventually lost to post-war chaos. The Death's Head Division's creator exits history without the dramatic finale his self-mythology might have scripted. May 8th through 9th brings Germany's surrender and the division's dissolution. Surviving Totenkopf's units retreat toward American lines rather than face Soviet capture, soldiers understanding that SS insignia guarantees harsh treatment from Russians who remember Barbarossa atrocities. Approximately 6,200 men surrender to American forces near the Austrian-Czech border, mix of combat troops and rear echelon personnel. American intelligence officers identify the division through prisoner interrogations, noting in reports that Totenkopf remains organized and disciplined even in defeat. Soldiers maintain unit cohesion, follow orders from surviving officers, cooperate with initial processing. This orderliness reflects institutional culture's persistence. The division that valued discipline and hierarchy maintains those characteristics even as the regime it served collapses. The post-war reckoning begins with administrative decisions, rather than criminal prosecutions. Nuremberg trials declare Waffen-SS criminal organization in October 1946, meaning membership alone creates presumption of participation in criminal activities. This designation affects all Totenkopf survivors, marking them as members of organization that International Military Tribunal found complicit in crimes against humanity. But organizational guilt doesn't automatically produce individual prosecutions. Allied authorities lack resources to try every SS soldier. Many war crimes lack sufficient documentation, and Cold War's beginning shifts priorities from punishment to rebuilding Germany as Western ally. The gap between organizational criminality and individual accountability will define post-war justice's limitations. Specific war crimes prosecutions, targeting top members, proceed slowly through late 1940s and into 1950s. The Les Paradis massacre from May 1940 produces first major trial when British authorities locate Fritz Knorklein in 1946. Private Pooley and Private O'Callagher, who survived by hiding under corpses, provide eyewitness testimony identifying Knorklein as officer who ordered the executions. The trial proceeds with unusual swiftness. Knorklein's guilt is indisputable given surviving witnesses and forensic evidence. British military court sentences him to death by hanging, executed in January 1949. The trial establishes crucial precedent. Superior orders don't excuse war crimes, officers bear responsibility for subordinates' actions, and SS membership creates presumption of knowledge about criminal conduct. Kharkov massacres produce more complex prosecutions, extending into the 1960s. Soviet war crimes investigations document hospital killings, execution of prisoners, and systematic violence against civilians during March 1943. But prosecutions face challenges. Many perpetrators died during the war. Survivors scatter across occupied zones, documentation was destroyed or lost, and Western authorities distrust Soviet evidence given Cold War tensions. Trials that proceed typically result in mixed outcomes, some convictions with substantial sentences, some acquittals where evidence proves insufficient, many cases dismissed due to witnesses' deaths or unavailability. By 1964, when major prosecutions conclude, 229 Totenkopf members have faced trial for war crimes, 73 received death sentences, 109 imprisonment, 47 acquittals. These numbers represent tiny fraction of probable criminality. Best estimates suggest only 12% of documented war crimes result in prosecutions. The arithmetic of destruction across the division's existence reveals the war's grinding totality. Approximately 138,000 men served in the Totenkopf division between its 1939 formation and 1945 dissolution, figure accounting for replacements flowing into the division as casualties created vacancies. Of these, roughly 74,000 died or went missing, 53% fatality rate that exceeds most Wehrmacht divisions, and reflects the unit's consistent assignment to crisis points. Another 35,000 suffered wounds, many permanently disabling. Only 29,000 men who served in the division emerged from the war physically intact, though psychological damage affected virtually everyone who experienced sustained combat. These statistics validate the division's combat intensity while raising questions about whether tactical effectiveness justified human costs. Knight's Cross decorations provide metric for both valor and ideology's military integration. 47 Totenkopf soldiers received Knight's Crosses during the war, Germany's premier valor decoration awarded for exceptional courage or military achievement. 5 men survived the war with oak leaves additions recognizing sustained excellence. These decorations acknowledge genuine military accomplishments, holding impossible positions, destroying numerous enemy tanks, leading successful operations against overwhelming odds. But recipients also participated in or commanded units committing atrocities. Valor and criminality coexisted in same individuals, sometimes in same operations. German military establishment decorated officers for Kharkov performance despite knowing about hospital massacres, creating moral incoherence where combat excellence justified ignoring war crimes. Post-war efforts to separate clean military service from criminal conduct founder on this reality. The soldiers most decorated for bravery were often most complicit in atrocities. Missing accountability haunts post-war justice more than successful prosecutions. Estimated 12% prosecution rate means 88% of documented war crimes never faced legal reckoning. Perpetrators died during the war, escaped to South America or Middle East, assumed false identities, or simply lived openly in post-war Germany, where authorities lacked resources or will to pursue every case. Witnesses died in combat or concentration camps. Physical evidence was destroyed in fighting or deliberately eliminated. Documentation burned in bombing raids or fires set by retreating Germans. The Totenkopf division's destruction of its own records during final weeks of the war was systematic. Orders to burn personnel files, destroy operational logs, eliminate evidence that might support prosecutions. This deliberate evidence destruction combined with war's chaos ensures that comprehensive accounting of division's crimes remains impossible. Survivor organizations complicate post-war legacy. High-Chi Mutual Aid Society for Waffen SS veterans forms in 1950s, bringing together survivors from multiple SS divisions, including Totenkopf. The organization provides material assistance to disabled veterans and widows, typical veteran organization functions, but High-Chi also engages in historical revisionism, publishing memoirs that minimize atrocities, emphasizing combat achievements while dismissing war crimes as Allied propaganda, claiming Waffen-SS was military organization separate from concentration camp administration. Totenkopf veterans participate actively, attending reunions where they celebrate divisional history while ignoring or justifying criminality. This institutional memory preservation creates parallel narrative, SS soldiers as misunderstood warriors who fought honorably for their country, distinct from Nazi Party's ideological crimes. This narrative collapses under historical scrutiny, but persists in veteran circles and sympathetic publications. Individual survivors' trajectories vary widely. Some express regret, others remain unrepentant. Many maintain silence about their service. Max Seeler, the composite character representing enlisted experience, survived the war physically intact, but psychologically fractured. Demyansk memories caused nightmares for decades. Kharkov participation produced guilt that no rationalization fully suppressed. Post-war life involved factory work, marriage, children, surface normalcy, masking internal conflict between pride in having survived and shame about actions that survival required. Testimony at war crimes trials, forced confronting moral complexity, acknowledging participation in military organization that committed atrocities while maintaining personal innocence. This psychological tension, wanting recognition for courage while denying complicity in crimes, characterizes many veterans' post-war experience. Some achieve synthesis through selective memory, others through complete silence, few through honest reckoning with their service's moral dimensions. Historical assessment confronts the division's fundamental contradiction: simultaneous military effectiveness and moral depravity. Totenkopf Division was objectively elite formation by war's middle period, tactically competent, operationally flexible, capable of complex missions under difficult circumstances. Officers demonstrated professional military skills. Soldiers fought courageously against dangerous opponents. The organization achieved objectives that defeated lesser formations. These military virtues merit acknowledgement, but they coexisted with, indeed, emerged from institutional culture founded on concentration camp brutality, sustained by ideological fanaticism, and expressed through systematic war crimes. Effectiveness and criminality weren't opposing characteristics requiring reconciliation. They were complementary products of institutional design that valued ruthlessness as supreme military virtue. The question the Totenkopf Division poses for military ethics and history is whether combat effectiveness absent moral constraints represents success or failure. Wehrmacht generals who valued SS divisions' battlefield contributions, despite knowing their criminal conduct, chose tactical utility over ethical consistency. Allied commanders who studied SS tactics to improve their own forces separated professional military analysis from moral judgment. Post-war historians who analyze divisions' operations must decide whether describing tactical excellence constitutes implicit endorsement or necessary understanding. The division's history resists simple narratives, neither purely condemning its existence nor praising its achievements captures the complex reality of military organization that excelled at both conventional warfare and systematic atrocity. Soviet versus Western prosecution approaches reflected different justice philosophies and geopolitical contexts. Soviet trials emphasized collective SS guilt, treating divisional membership as sufficient proof of criminality, imposing harsh sentences based on organizational affiliation rather than proven individual acts. Western trials required individual proof of specific crimes, distinguishing between combat service and war crimes, acquitting defendants where evidence was insufficient. These different approaches produced divergent outcomes. Soviet proceedings convicted more defendants, but faced legitimacy questions given show trial precedents. Western proceedings acquitted more defendants, but established legal precedents, emphasizing individual responsibility. Neither approach achieved comprehensive justice. Too many perpetrators escaped accountability, too many victims received no recognition, too many crimes remained unpunished. The Totenkopf Division's ultimate legacy is cautionary rather than inspirational. It demonstrates that military effectiveness and moral criminality can coexist in same institution, that tactical competence doesn't require or indicate ethical conduct, that courage in combat and enthusiasm for atrocity aren't contradictory. The death's head symbol that marked the division represented both genuine combat capability and systematic brutality. Acknowledging the first doesn't excuse the second, condemning the second doesn't erase the first. Military historians study the division's tactics, equipment, and operations to understand mechanized warfare's evolution. Moral historians study the same organization to understand how institutions transform ordinary men into war criminals. Both perspectives are necessary. Neither is sufficient alone. The Totenkopf Division remains case study in military effectiveness divorced from moral legitimacy, proving that armies can excel at their tactical missions while serving criminal strategic purposes. That lesson, uncomfortable, complex, resistant to simplification, justifies examining the division's history despite its disturbing content. Understanding how effectiveness and atrocity coexisted in single organization helps prevent future militaries from repeating the same moral failures while pursuing tactical excellence.